A blood-red sunset descended over the forest when a deafening explosion was heard. It was impossible to see anything through the dust cloud until it began to clear. A flash of light cut through the thick dust and smoke shooting upward. The two men clashed, unwilling to give in to each other, sparks flying from the blades of their swords. Clumps of dirt flew from underfoot, creating new clouds of dust around. "I'm impressed," the opponent said mockingly, as if trying to tease the young man with scars on his face. The opponent was older, but he clearly respected the fortitude of the one he was fighting, because the Phantom Swordmaster did not give up despite a serious injury. The young man struck again, sending purple sparks flying from his opponent's weapon, and the latter could not resist praising him again, amazed by his swordsmanship. However, the experienced fighter was able to parry the blow, causing his young opponent to recoil with a loud cry and barely remain on his feet. Purple energy flared around the old man's sword, as if he were mocking his opponent, claiming that it was impossible to use energy in such a state, and that it was a miracle that the young man was able to move at all. The enemy ordered him not to resist. His eyes turned white, and he swung his sword, intending to plunge the young man into eternal sleep. The old man rushed forward, gritting his teeth and intending to finish the fight. He sent a thick wave of energy forward. Purple sparks flew in all directions. The young man put his hands in front of himself, trying to protect himself from the energy that was knocking him down. But at that very moment, he was struck by a kick to the stomach, without having time to regroup. The old man was already preparing to strike again while the young man was disarmed and lying on the ground. The enemy cut the ground with a stream of energy. Cracks formed under the tip of the sword, and the young man barely managed to jump aside. He decided to take advantage of the enraged old man's hesitation. The enemy's sword flew out from his unclenched fingers, cutting through the air with a whistle. With a deft blow, the swordmaster disarmed the old man. Grabbing his sword and gritting his teeth, the young man prepared for a new fight. Rushing forward, he almost pierced his opponent, but he deftly dodged. The blade flashed in front of the old man's face, grazing his cheekbone, and drops of blood sprayed out. Once again, the master took advantage of the moment and struck his opponent with all his might, depriving him of the opportunity to repel the attack. He landed on the ground with a thud, stunned by the force of the impact. "I won't allow it," he shouted, and, not intending to give in to his opponent, he raised his hand, purple mist streaming from his fingers. With a sharp wave of his hand, the old man launched a whirlwind of energy into the void. Surprise and confusion froze on his face. He couldn't understand where his opponent had disappeared to, and he didn't even suspect that the young man with a sword raised above his head would catch him right from behind. A shadow of fear flashed across the old man's face as he turned around. The last thing he saw was the dark figure of the master, illuminated by a flash of energy. The exhausted man closed his eyes and sighed tiredly. "Ghost Sword Master," he turned to his interlocutor and asked, "Did you cut off that old man's head?" No less tired than his partner, the young man raised his eyes to the sky and answered in the affirmative. He believed that the bloody massacre, which would go down in history as the Shanxi massacre, would end with the old man's death. Sitting on the battlefield, among the corpses, the swordmaster told his interlocutor that the fallen had appeared out of nowhere, calling themselves the Palace of the Black Knight, and had swept through more than a dozen small sects and clans over the past 3 days. Despite this, he was encouraged by the fact that the world was now witnessing an alliance between two rival factions. "Doko Han," said the interlocutor, who had been silent until then, and suddenly looked dejected. He sat hunched over and with his arms hanging down, doubting out loud that he would be able to fulfill his promise to duel with the techniques he had developed himself. "So, what are your dying thoughts?" Hong asked. The interlocutor smiled and agreed, adding that they had dedicated their entire lives to the sword. Even though he was an experienced warrior and had seen a lot, he still admired the master's fighting skills and his devotion to the sword. And he had one request. The interlocutor asked Hong to look after his disciple from the Mount Huashan sect. This request shocked the young man, even made him angry. The offended master decided that the dying man had already begun to rave. Smooth beads touched his palm, which lay peacefully on the ground. The interlocutor said that the beads in the shape of the plum blossom spirits are a relic of Mount Huashan, and it needs to be given to the leader of the sect. Hong, in even greater confusion, wanted to say something but stopped himself. The man was breathing heavily, and it was becoming clear that he didn't have much time left to live. The master looked away, unable to say anything. After a short silence, he said that he had a premonition of his own imminent death, and that the request was too serious, to which his interlocutor, with a heavy sigh, reminded him of their friendship and noted that they had no one else, and that he was still grateful to Han for everything, despite the awkwardness of the moment. The young man chuckled at his friend's words because he was right. It couldn't be otherwise. He grumbled that he would have to spend the rest of his life on Mount Huashan. But a sudden outburst interrupted him. An explosion of energy tore apart his friend, with whom Hong had just been calmly talking. Clouds of smoke and dust rose up again. Now, in place of the interlocutor, there was a purple spot of energy mixed with blood, and a severed arm lay a couple of meters away. Han turned around in confusion, staring into space. A new flash came out of nowhere, but the master seemed not to notice it. A purple wave of energy approached, cutting through the air. She rushed straight towards Han, who was sitting staring at the empty seat next to him. He clenched his teeth in anger, asking himself one question. "Who dared do this?" the master cried, clutching the hilt of his sword. His eyes turned yellow, burning with righteous anger, and he swung his sword, sparks flying and a stream of energy sent forth. The steel rang and cut through the void. Han rushed forward with the intention of finding the invisible enemy. Sparks flew into the sky, and a silhouette appeared in the distance, repelling the attack. The stranger's face was hidden behind a mask, and a stream of black energy flowed from his fingers. The enemy waved his hand, directing a counterattack towards the master. Han stared at the stranger's figure in surprise, not understanding what was happening. His face reflected bewilderment. He could not understand what kind of opponent he had got this time, and the enemy's fingers were already forming new energy balls. He stood opposite, his arms spread out, burning with flame, and prepared to strike again. The wind picked up particles of energy and lifted them into the sky. Purple clouds filled the entire space between the combatants, rising upward. The stranger's new blow was crushing and sweeping away everything in its path. An explosion echoed through the forest, this time more deafening. Through the clearing fog, the silhouette of Han, kneeling, was visible. The bleeding master could not believe what had happened. Crippled and missing an arm, he wondered how someone could be so strong. For a moment, he even thought that the head of the Black Knight Palace had risen. But, looking back at the lifeless body, he was convinced that this was not so. The masked stranger could be a hidden disciple or even the real head of the palace. Sitting in a pool of his own blood, Hong thought that this opponent was much stronger than the old master. And although he was weakened after the battle, the enemy was able to deprive him of his arm only with demonic energy. The severed arm and pool of blood reminded the master of his dead interlocutor. Hong thought with regret that he didn't even have a chance to bring his friend's body home. However, he was not going to give up, despite his crippled body. The young man gathered his courage and leaned on one knee, preparing to rise to his feet, his wrist adorned with the very same relic of Mount Huashan. The mask on the stranger's face made it impossible to see any emotion. Hong could only guess that he was surprised by his resilience. Intent on keeping his promise, the swordmaster rushed towards the abyss, shocking his opponent. Although the young man doubted that he would survive the fall from the cliff, he convinced himself that if there was hope, he had to believe. He was running from the one who had mercilessly dealt with his dying friend and deprived him of his hand. Han firmly decided that he would not forget this and would take revenge. There was very little left to the edge of the abyss when another wave of energy cut through the air along with the body of the swordmaster. He looked in surprise from under his thick bangs towards his opponent. He stood in the distance, enveloped in a purple glow, watching as the cut-in-half Han fell into the abyss. Long black locks of hair fluttered in the wind. The stranger's posture expressed calm and concentration. He grinned, his eyes glittering under his mask, and he fired another ball of energy towards Han. The swordmaster, on the brink of death, found the strength only to curse at his opponent. He knew he had failed, and his last words, the order not to laugh, were carried away into the abyss along with his severed body. The rock was empty, leaving behind only the traces of the struggle, rising clouds of dust and sand. Hong fell into the abyss with a feeling of guilt, and words about forgiveness were visible in his fading consciousness. He believed that he would not be able to keep the promise he made to his friend. The beads on his bloody wrist were a reminder of what had happened. Red sparks shot through the tree leaves, and the severed body fell into the void. Among the rustling of leaves, voices could be heard. Someone was repeating something about a pulse beating. The invisible interlocutors sounded surprised and believed that the heavens had helped. Hong suddenly thought that he might still be alive, but was that possible? When he tried to open his eyes, he saw two barely distinguishable figures. The young man sitting next to him asked him to wake up. Looking tiredly ahead, the swordmaster couldn't understand why he was called senior disciple. An alarmed voice turned to Elder Byukjin and exclaimed that the senior disciple had opened his eyes. The guy was lying on the floor, bandaged and pierced with needles, with a worried assistant sitting next to him. "You're doing great, Mu Hui. Don't you dare leave us again." A voice came from somewhere off to the side. Caring hands lifted his head, and the guy turned his surprised gaze to the person sitting next to him. The man holding him seemed familiar, and he said he had resorted to acupuncture, thinking it was too late. The old man added that the heavens had been favorable and uttered the name of one of the highest deities of Taoism, Yuanshi Tianzong. Hong realized that this old man was the elder of Mount Huashan, Byuk-jin, and he asked him to stay there and again called him by a false name. Confused and exhausted, he looked at the elder and could not say anything. I tried to understand why they call him by this name until I realized it. Hui was a second-generation elder disciple of the Mount Huashan sect. Memories of a friend teaching a young man how to handle a sword properly came to mind. Hui was a student of the deceased Hyun Jo, but why was Hong called by his name? The swordmaster had already thought that the old man had completely lost his mind when he suddenly remembered that very bracelet, the relic that he was supposed to give to the leader of the sect. Han's eyes widened in shock, realization hitting him instantly. The elder's assistant stood nearby and looked at him in surprise while he muttered about the light from the past. The young man apologized in confusion, ignoring Hong's mutterings, and said that the wounds had not yet healed, again calling him a senior disciple. "You shouldn't talk," warned the assistant, sitting by the window, which offered a beautiful view. Delicate pink flower petals fell outside the window, and a thin layer of snow settled on the roof of the temple. "Going somewhere?" the young man heard behind him as he rose to his feet and headed away. The old man stood next to the vase, tidying up the plant, looking calm, and even the rude affirmative answer did not disturb him. Jin turned around and praised the student, adding that he really needed to move a little. He asked not to go far because the young man had spent the whole of the previous week in bed and had not eaten properly. Accepting the elder's words, Hong went out into the courtyard, where he found a well with water. The snow had already melted. A few clouds were floating in the sky, but the sun was shining over the temple. Han passed the courtyard and came across another spring. The water in it was crystal clear. He scooped it up into his palms and splashed it on his face, deciding to refresh himself this way and put his thoughts in order. Han exhaled. He sat on the stones and thought that only a week had passed. Looking at his reflection and seeing someone else's face in it, the young man expressed his thoughts out loud. A week seemed like a whole year. For the last 7 days, he had been having a dream. Hui's life from birth, he saw him as a baby in the arms of an adult. A little boy, uncertainly holding a wooden sword in his fingers but with the look of a warrior. A young man who diligently studied sword-fighting techniques. Hui's defeats and failures, the dissatisfied Zhuo towering over his student, all of this also appeared in his dreams. All last week, Hong had been dreaming about the 2 decades of happy life of the senior disciple. And then I dreamed of a burning temple tower and disciples hurrying to the battlefield. A brutal battle with enemies against the backdrop of destruction and explosions. Han saw explosions, blood, smoke, and the deaths of those who were weaker, as well as warriors confidently holding swords in their hands. He saw the elder towering over the burning temple buildings, watching everything. Everything seemed too clear and vivid, not like a dream, as if he really heard the foundation boards creaking and his comrades calling him. Burning roofs, the cries of the fighters, the clanging of blades. It was all too realistic. The swordmaster saw his opponent's teeth clenched in rage and the wrinkles that appeared from zeal on his face. The man advanced on his opponent, threatening to hit him with another blow. But at that very moment, another man standing firmly on his feet intervened in this fight. Hui parried the attack, but the opponent's blow was so powerful that it cut his sword in half, and the blood that splattered to the side meant that the young man was wounded. Hong did not hide his condemnation when he recalled all his dreams. He believed that with such a weak body, the senior disciple should have put himself above the others. He pressed his palm to his bandaged chest, realizing that Hui had died from this injury. The swordmaster remembered seeing the light emanating from the relic when he was on the verge of death, and decided that it was all because of the plum blossom spirits. Looking again at the reflection in the water, he was convinced that he saw Hui's face. However, he was tormented by the question of why it was he, and not Zhuo, who ended up in the young man's body. My friend's face came to mind shortly before his death, his half-closed eyes and tired smile. "Is this fate?" Hong asked, looking into the water, but only silence answered. He sighed heavily. The current circumstances were not at all encouraging, but the only thing that motivated him was another chance at life, which he was not going to miss. Rising from the rocks and frowning, the boy suddenly remembered his last opponent, the masked man, whom he wanted to cruelly avenge for the death of his friend and his own. The memories of this stranger and his strength still lived in his mind. He was stronger than the master of the Black Knight Palace, and Hong suddenly thought that he would have died anyway. As he climbed the long stairs, He decided that he had to become stronger than before to have a chance of defeating such a powerful enemy. The young man entered a small, half-empty room. There was no one inside. Zhuo's voice asking him to look after his disciple from the Huashan mountain sect suddenly sounded in his head as Hong walked forward, and then a scene from a dream appeared in his mind. A teacher urging his disciples not to be afraid, but to be the ones who would protect the Mount Huashan sect. Han walked over to the shelf with scrolls and books and picked one up. Later, another book landed in front of him with a bang. Hong, or more precisely Hui, was now sitting on the floor. The table was strewn with scrolls, books, and tablets. He intended to fulfill the promise he made to Zhuo and avenge his death no matter what. In a building with a leaky roof, the issue of rebuilding 8 pavilions was being decided. 4 elderly men sat at a table, discussing the need for rebuilding because the damage from the last ambush was high, but funds were insufficient due to previous expenses. Bayuk-san merely confirmed this and added that revenue and the number of visitors would decline sharply for some time. Silence reigned. The men sat, exchanging glances. A cup of cold tea stood in front of each. But that was not important now. Byuk-yu, the sect leader, thought about avoiding large expenditures, but he only said out loud that they should start by rebuilding the most important pavilion. He then turned to Jin, asking if his students were recovering, to which he confirmed that everyone was getting better. Even the most seriously injured were no longer feeling so bad, and asked them not to worry. You thought this was good news, but he suddenly asked about Hui, because the news about Zhuo must have been very shocking to him. Jin replied that the young man had endured them much better than he had expected, and that his wounds had almost healed, and he had even gone outside, which surprised San, who had been sitting silently until then. The leader was satisfied with the answer, but advised Jin to check on his student from time to time, since the elder knew very well what kind of child Hui was. The man was worried that the boy might just be pretending, and hoped that he would be able to cope with his grief. The stack of books, tablets, and scrolls grew larger and larger. Han sat on the floor reading another book, surrounded by the chaos he had created. In front of him lay a book with another image of military equipment. He was reading intently, but suddenly memories arose that distracted him. They were standing together with Zhuo, watching the people practicing, and his friend asked him how he liked the Huashan sect disciples. Zhuo asked Hong what he thought of them, and Hong, folding his arms across his chest, replied that they were no good. The friend agreed, but added that the sect was going through hard times. He spoke with condemnation about the fact that students considered sword technique to be the pinnacle of changeability and illusion, which makes plum flowers bloom. But their idea of the perfection of technique was deceptive. Both understood that the future that awaited a sect incapable of thinking and developing new paths was collapse. The students in front of them were diligently honing their technique. But was there any point? The sky was covered with clouds. The wind picked up the petals of flowers that had fallen from the tree and carried them upward. Zhuo stood with his arms crossed behind his back and looking ahead. He wanted to show his students that the plum blossom sword technique was not the only one in the world, and that there was a higher level they could achieve. Isn't that why you wanted to create your own sword techniques and use them in future duels? Hong asked, peering out from under his bangs. Zhuo's words echoed in his head, saying that the Phantom Swordmaster, the best in the unconventional faction, did not receive his title for nothing, because he had perfected various combat techniques, reached a new level, and his friend wanted to create something new with him. But Hong thought that when he first saw the disciples of the Huashan sect, he thought that the problem lay in the mountain itself, and despite the sect's fame, over the past 100 years they had not been able to cultivate a single talent other than Zhuo. However, this was foolish of him, because he only managed to learn the basic martial arts, such as the six-fold combination handling technique and the six-fold combination sword technique, both of which turned out to be flawless. The young man continued to read and study, reflecting on the power of the sect. Closing the book, he remembered that Zhuo wanted to show his students a new kingdom, created a new sword technique, but never finished it. And Hong was inspired by the idea of doing it for him to fulfill his promise. The sword technique had to belong only to Mount Huashan. It couldn't just be the shape and movements of the mountain. Its intentions had to match the intentions of the mountain, the young man thought, as he closed the book and put it aside. He picked up another one lying open nearby, deciding to understand the Huashan teachings and start from the very basics, and only then move on to the Zhuo sword technique. Hong sat with his legs crossed and his hands folded in front of him, breathing deeply and trying to concentrate. As he exhaled, a bluish vortex of energy formed around him. It passed through the entire body, concentrating in the head and chest, and Hong intended to erase all the combat techniques that Hui had learned, since if they mastered the same technique, they would understand it differently. And the knowledge gained by the true owner of the body could not belong to the sword master in full. Blue sparks, like electrical discharges, touched every part of the body. The young man thought that practice should not be underestimated, even if it is the most basic. Hong chuckled, thinking that in his past life he had only pursued efficiency and used unconventional techniques. But the sword techniques of Mount Huashan were different from each other, and he could learn something completely different. Sitting among the variety of teaching books and scrolls, he came to the conclusion that this was the end of the life of the phantom swordmaster, who cared only about the sword. Sweat was streaming down his face from the use of energy, but his gaze was determined because he firmly accepted his new self, acknowledged that he was now Mu Hui. The sun illuminated the courtyard, reflecting on the cornice and breaking through the dense foliage of the trees. One of the students was climbing a long staircase. His gaze was directed forward, as if he was looking for someone or perhaps had already found them. The calm of the concentrated Hui was interrupted by a loud cry. The young man wondered if the senior disciple was inside. Hui opened one eye and the cry was repeated again, the student searching for him persistently repeating his question. The door creaked open, which wasn't unexpected, since they were looking for him so much. The student stood in front of Hui and looked at him in surprise, unable to utter a word. "Are you Mu Chul?" the senior disciple asked, looking up at the newcomer. He asked what brought Chul to him, and he began to explain that he came to visit because 3 days had already passed since Hui left the Palace of Medicine of Harmony, and besides, he was absent from morning training. This information surprised Hui. Did he really spend 3 days studying the techniques? He stood up and walked out into the street, Chul silently waiting for him to say something in his defense. Hui remembered that he hadn't eaten anything for a whole week, according to the elder, and he looked the part. But out loud he only spoke about his own ignorance of the time and suggested going to the training hall, to which Chul agreed. However, he turned to look at the senior disciple, glancing at him uneasily before heading into the hall. He was walking down the steps, thinking about the changes in Hui, and Hui suddenly thought that it would be nice to have a drink. "The plum blossoms are plentiful and swaying in the wind," the teacher shouted. He looked young, with ribbons woven into his long hair, but his expression and skill with the sword spoke of experience. The students repeated every movement of the teacher, diligently throwing their hands with swords forward and accompanying them with loud exclamations. The teacher turned to a student named Mu Ryun, demanding that he keep his hand higher. "Yes, sir," Ryan shouted, complying with his mentor's demand. Hui watched the students, thinking that his expectations had been met. The students were as bad as they had been the day he had seen them practice for the first time. Their legs were shaking, which made it difficult to maintain balance and impaired their balance. The young men's stance left much to be desired. They were unable to strengthen their attacks, and they lacked the basics of training. He was horrified by their awkwardness, then glanced over his shoulder, thinking that the instructor wasn't so bad. Hui even tried to remember his name. The boy with the ribbon in his hair and the determined look was called Mu Jin. Watching the instructor, Hui considered his mentorship to be fortunate, as Jin was quite good at correcting his students' mistakes. He wondered why this guy was performing the duties of a senior disciple, and came to the conclusion that the owner of the body he was trapped in was too withdrawn. He also lacks leadership qualities and martial arts skills, but it was clear that Jin knew how to lead others, had great potential, and the students around him listened to him. Hui crossed his arms behind his back as he continued to watch and thought that Jin had good skills and a strong spirit, and was well deserving of taking on the role of head disciple. Looking again towards his mentor, he thought that he wouldn't mind handing over this role to him, but sooner. Jin's shout, signifying the end of the training, brought me out of my thoughts. The students' plaintive voices were heard everywhere. Someone complained that the teacher had become stricter. But suddenly Hui was noticed. One of the students asked how he was feeling, and the senior student only replied that everything was fine. However, the changes that had happened to Hui did not go unnoticed. The surprised student did not take his eyes off him. The sound of footsteps on the steps caught Hui's attention, and the mentor addressed him. He looked down and expressed his regrets for not being able to greet Hui due to training. He turned around, looked at Jin, and replied that everything was fine. He assumed that perhaps what he was supposed to do was difficult, but he was mentally surprised by Jin's lack of respect for hierarchy, since he was still standing on the stairs, towering over the elder. The mentor bowed and thanked him for the opportunity, but Hui replied that he would take over the mentoring himself. Jin looked up at him from under his bangs, stunned by such a statement. There were surprised responses from the crowd, and the students were no less shocked. Sweat appeared on Chiel's face. He suddenly realized that he hadn't imagined it. Hui had really changed. Jin's face changed. He looked dissatisfied with the senior disciple's words and reminded him that he himself had told him to take up mentoring. Hui stood and looked at the instructor, who clenched his hands into fists, then asked what was wrong with his decision to return to his duties. But Jin was not going to give up and replied that Hui forced him to teach classes because he was not confident in his abilities. The senior student watched the dissatisfied youth closely. He already understood everything. A grin spread across his face. Looking at Jin's stubbornness, Hui came to the conclusion that he wanted to become the head disciple. By becoming a chief disciple, a person laid claim to the position of leader of the sect in the future. After the massacre, the number of disciples in the sect decreased, and the elders and surviving first-generation disciples were busy rebuilding. Standing in front of Jin, Hui thought that it would be more effective to change the second-generation disciples than to try to change the elders and first-generation disciples. But the existence of the violet aura circulation technique was a source of concern, as only the leader and chief disciple of the Huashan sect could master it, and it was one of the top 10 techniques. Without taking his eyes off Jin, Hui thought about how he should become the chief disciple, but it was unlikely that the mentor would understand him correctly. "Do you think you have the right to do this?" Jin asked suddenly, not intending to back down. He brazenly asked what Hui was doing when the Black Knight Palace invaded the temple grounds, to which Chal indignantly interrupted him. But Hui was ready to continue listening to the furious speeches of the mentor, who openly condemned the senior disciple. Jin sarcastically asked if he had managed to save any of his own, or kill any of his enemies, adding that Hui had become nothing but a burden to the elders. But the young man only smirked. The mentor was not about to finish, adding that some students had taken an example from Hui in that battle, and he momentarily remembered faces full of determination. Every word Jin spoke was laced with condemnation, and the students stood in the square with their heads bowed as the teacher continued his angry tirade. Hui lowered his head and closed his eyes. He agreed with Jin's words. But this only seemed to anger the young man. He gritted his teeth, looking at the calm senior disciple. He raised his palm and expressed his intention to take responsibility as a senior disciple. But Jin interrupted him. Hong was not going to give up. Even though his speech was interrupted, he was still ready to continue. He took a few steps and headed towards the stairs, insisting that Jin didn't understand. The surprised mentor watched as Hui climbed up towards him step by step. Jin's gaze changed from angry to wary. He wanted to ask a question but didn't have time. Hui approached, looked at him with burning eyes and asked since when he should look up to him. His face did not express anything good. He asked his frozen interlocutor why he had to persuade him and ask permission. Jin froze when Hui said that he was presenting a fait accompli, not trying to persuade. The mentor looked confused, even frightened. He could not understand what had happened to the senior disciple. Jin didn't recognize the man standing in front of him, as if he were a stranger. Hui informed the speechless instructor that he would be taking over morning training from tomorrow, and if he didn't agree with anything, he would have to come after class. Before leaving, he added mockingly so that Jin wouldn't be so upset, surprising Chal with his words. And the stunned Jin silently looked after him. However, frowning, he still managed to express his suspicions about the changed Hui. Without turning around, the senior disciple assumed that a person changes after returning from the other world, and Jin could certainly confirm this. The confused students couldn't understand what had happened. It wasn't the first time they had seen their teacher angry. As they left the training grounds, they discussed the appointment of the senior disciple as their mentor. The young man turned to his partner, who only confirmed that Jin had indeed allowed the elder to take them. The students discussed the angry teacher. One of them, Mu Ryun, was worried, because Hui's level of skill was known to everyone. His interlocutor suggested doing something, and Ryun asked what he had come up with. The young man only turned around, looking at his partner. A plan of action was already maturing in his head. They had to talk to the elder. The moon illuminated the courtyard. Two people were sneaking up to one of the buildings with the intention of talking. Hui sat at the table, still bandaged. He continued to study techniques. A sword lay on the floor next to him. He heard something outside, but did not turn around, guessing that someone had decided to visit him. And although he was concentrated, he still glanced over his shoulder. A voice from outside announced that it wanted to talk. The stranger wanted to discuss something in private, but Hui's hand had already reached for the hilt of his sword. Grabbing his sword and becoming wary, he expressed interest in talking with his interlocutor, who had not yet revealed himself. The student was tense, as if he was going to execution and not just to talk. The older student came outside, rubbing the back of his head, his chest and arms still bandaged. He stood in front of the boys, holding a wooden sword in his hands, and this greatly surprised the young people. The young men understood that using a wooden sword was not at all like Hui, but one of them still began to speak, asking the elder to take his words back, because Jin refused to argue with him, just to save his face. Hui looked calm. He assumed that it was the master who sent his students to him at such a late hour. But the student objected. It was their personal initiative, and such a statement surprised Hui. However, he stated that nothing depended on them, and decided to pretend that this conversation had not happened, to which one of the interlocutors again objected. Both stood with their legs apart and their fists clenched. They and their partner had done this not out of prejudice, but out of a desire to learn from a truly experienced mentor. The conversation turned from calm to accusatory. The student accused the elder of inexperience and lack of skills, which greatly surprised his partner. Hui frowned. The students had crossed the line with such words and he didn't like it. He looked at them from under his bangs and noticed the lack of hierarchy on Mount Huashan. Having to prove to his interlocutors that their doubts were unfounded, he ordered them to take out their swords, which greatly surprised the young men. The young man, who had been silent until then, even asked again if the elder was serious. But Hui understood the feelings of these guys and confirmed the seriousness of his intentions, advancing on them. No one was going to retreat, and the one who initiated the conversation was the first to take the sword from his belt. Asking him not to regret it, he moved towards Hui, determined to strike down the elder with his weapon, while his partner stood aside. But Hui deftly parried the attack, knocking the sword out of the attacker's hand, and he cried out in pain. He struck the student in the stomach with the handle, and he bent over with a heavy exhalation. He fell to his knees before the unwavering youth, who confidently held the sword in his hands and did not even move from the spot. A second scream was heard from the side as Hui raised his sword over his friend's head. Hearing the sound, Hui turned around but did not move away. He swung his sword deftly, and the young man who was about to attack him lost his sword and fell. The defeated disciples lay on the ground, breathing heavily and trying to recover, while the elder disciple towered over them. Breathing heavily, covered in drool and sweat, one of the students wanted to say that they lost, but Hui interrupted him. He grabbed the boy by the collar and said it was time to teach them a lesson, the sword still resting in his hand. The student looked up in fear. He did not understand what the elder meant. The student's leg was shaking. The loser was lying on the ground. "So, are you happy now?" Hui asked the battered men standing right in front of him, to which they replied in the affirmative. He towered over them and was able to defeat them with serious injuries. One face was covered in bruises. He bashfully covered his eyes. The second one was lying face down. He didn't have the strength to get up. Hui was pleased that the young people had learned their lesson and promised to forget about what happened. Everyone makes mistakes. He advised the boys to rest, as morning training was coming soon, and they thanked the elder for his kindness. Holding each other, they rose from their knees and headed towards the stairs. Hui silently watched the departing students, who had accepted defeat. He felt that he was being watched and asked the invisible observer to come out of hiding. Chol was surprised by Hui's insight, and he only asked what was troubling him. Shaking off the leaves, the young man said that he saw Mu-sun and Mu-hong heading towards the building. Chol told how he went after the students, wanting to keep an eye on them, but he didn't even think that the senior student would be able to handle them. They looked at each other. Hui's face seemed serene. He was silent, looking at his interlocutor and thinking about the students and their attitude towards Hui. Some kept their distance but showed respect, while others looked down on him and spoke ill of him. But Chol was neither of those. He often helped Hui, but was quite rude and cold. Hui was young and didn't understand the meaning of Chol's help while in his body, although it was obvious that the young man was worried. The weakness of the senior disciple was the reason for the help. Chol was worried, thinking that San and Hong would seriously injure him. That was why he stood before him here, under the moon, with his surveillance revealed, wanting to make sure that Hui was okay. Understanding came too quickly. As soon as he looked at the guy, Chol had always protected the former owner of this body. Something plausible had to be invented, and the young man blurted out that he had achieved enlightenment. The answer greatly surprised Chol. He looked at the senior disciple with wide eyes and even asked again about enlightenment. Hui turned away and said that he would tell about it at morning practice, and Cholyu advised him to go back. Although he responded with obedience, he continued to stand and watch the guy leave. It was hard to imagine what kind of enlightenment Hui could achieve, considering he was using a beginner-level technique. However, when he spied on the fighting trio, he was amazed. The older one performed the technique simply superbly, and it was interesting to see what else he had learned. As he left the courtyard, Chul reflected on Hui's changes and looked forward to his morning training, while Hui tried to come up with excuses for the others. Ryun looked skeptically at the crippled guy sitting opposite him. He stood with his arms crossed over his chest, surprised that the students had been beaten. The decision wasn't easy for them. The beatings were quite severe, and Hui clearly wouldn't tolerate disrespect. However, Ryun found his friend's words implausible and sent them off to prepare for morning training. Holding each other, San and Hong walked away, upset by their comrade's distrust and only hoping that he would not go against the senior disciple, as it meant risking being beaten to death. Jin appeared out of nowhere and looked questioningly at the students. Approaching Ryun, the mentor asked what had happened, since the students looked terrible and could barely move. Ryun calmly replied that nothing special had happened, but his former mentor looked at him with disbelief. He sat down opposite, trying to comprehend his interlocutor's words. Jin decided to punish San and Hong later, which greatly shocked the bewildered Ryun. But Jin was adamant. He believed that the senior disciple would retreat if he realized the impossibility of the task of mentoring. Jin felt ashamed of everything. Even though Ryun wanted to justify the student's concern, he cut him off mid-sentence. He rose from the bench and headed for the exit, intending to deal with everything himself. Jin left the confused Ryun alone, and he fell into deep thought. As soon as the sun rose over the temple, Hui's voice was heard in the square. He towered over the students, looked them over, made sure that they were all there, and this undoubtedly pleased him. The elder lowered his head and closed his eyes, intending to speak. Jin stood below, his head bombarded with questions about Hui. His gaze caught on the beaten San and Hong. Having lost his title of mentor, he stood next to the rest of the students. The new mentor looked determined and continued speaking. He stood with his hands on the hilt of his sword, talking about strength and weakness, for which there was only one reason, and that was the foundations. The elder informed the students that morning training sessions would now include lessons on mastering the six-fold combination technique. This statement greatly surprised the students, but everyone remained silent, awaiting further instructions. Hui closed his eyes as he spoke, hoping to convey to his students everything he understood. He looked thoughtfully at everyone standing below. The students looked at each other, not daring to object. But someone spoke up, and all eyes turned in his direction. It was Ryun, and his speech surprised the others. He looked determined as he took the initiative to object to the new mentor. Shocked cries came from all sides. The students were amazed at the impudence of their comrade. Ryun expressed indignation. It was disgusting to him to realize that the sect was called famous, but in reality no one dared to argue about the training. However, Hui, remaining calm, ordered Ryun to come up to him and discuss the dissatisfaction. The crowd of students watched the proceedings, frozen with excitement. Jin frowned as he looked up, tensing up at Ryun's sudden display of boldness. Meanwhile, Ryun was climbing up to the elder. He grinned, confident in himself and his own words, not intimidated by Hui's strength. The sun's glare reflected off the smooth surface. Ryun explained to the elder, expressing his doubts about his leadership of the training. But Hui himself calmly added that his skills were terrible. He praised Ryun, who was the only one who dared to point out the mentor's lack of experience, but he wasn't angry. Turning his gaze back to the others, the elder drew their attention and asked them to listen. He declared that he would not take a single step, but would block Ryun's attacks with the six-fold sword combination technique, and these words left the students in shock. The mentor set conditions, declaring that he would lose if he made a move or Ryun touched him with his wooden sword, and in that case, he promised to take back his words about teaching the technique. After thinking for a moment and looking down, Hui decided to add something. His gaze fell on Jin, standing below and listening, and the elder promised to take back his words about morning training too. Ryun couldn't help but call him overconfident, but Hui pretended not to understand, not even looking at him. The young man was ready to fight with his new mentor and mockingly asked him not to cry if he lost in front of everyone. Only Hui was truly confident in himself. He wanted to test his strength and the strength of his student, to see how it would all end. Ryun rushed forward with lightning speed, ready to strike the new mentor. He swung his sword with concentration, but Hui blocked the blow without moving. He stood calmly, watched the student's attacks, and continued to reflect the blows of his sword with his own. Ryun struck again and again, but never once touched his mentor, who defended himself and fought back with an inscrutable face. The other students watched in confusion as their comrade fought with the senior student. The clanging of swords came from the veranda. The boards creaked under Ryun's feet. He kept trying to break his mentor to not let him win, but Hui stood there, unwavering. The first, second, third, fourth swings of the sword flew towards the enemy. Those watching the battle recognized the technique. It was wind sword concentration. Chol, who was closely watching what was happening on the veranda, thought that Ryun understood technology better than anyone else. But there was something obvious. both to him and to everyone else. Hui blocked all attacks with ease. He turned to the exhausted student, his words tinged with mockery. "Perhaps there's something better?" the senior disciple asked, blocking another blow. Ryun gritted his teeth and exhaled. Looking at his mentor, he realized that he could do nothing more. Standing on the veranda in front of a crowd of comrades who were watching from below, he did not know how to get out of the situation. The students began to talk among themselves. They admitted that Ryun was good, but the senior student kept his balance perfectly. The guys did not recognize him. Jin looked up as shocked as the others. He couldn't believe what he saw. How? This was the only question that swirled through the former mentor's mind. Another blow was parried, but Hui remained standing in place. Ryun looked at him from under his bangs, which had become disheveled during the battle, and did not know how to deal with his opponent. But the problem wasn't the elder's strength, as he quickly pointed out, and Ryun's eyes widened in surprise. Hui began to talk about the strength that you need to put into the sword with your whole body. And it is more important to watch your feet, because the weapon becomes useless if you just swing it. The elder's words, which everyone heard, did not only apply to Ryun. A dumbfounded Ryun kept his gaze fixed on his mentor. Sweat streamed down the face of the suddenly aware young man. However, Hui interpreted this in his own way, deciding that the student did not understand anything. He was about to show the frozen Ryun how to use the sword and raised it up. Before the boy could say anything, he felt the full force of the blow. The terrified students watched as their new mentor explained swordsmanship techniques in action. When Hui ordered Hong and San to come up to him and pick up Ryun to take him to the Palace of Harmony Medicine, they rushed towards the stairs, obeying the order. Not wanting to interrupt the training, the elder ordered the petrified students to raise their swords. He watched as one by one the students raised their swords. The boys were frightened by what had happened, but they obeyed, and Hui made sure there were no objections. With their swords raised, the students awaited further instructions from their new mentor. With an unwavering face and Ryun's blood on his cheek, Hui calmly announced the start of morning training. The sun was high, the weather was beautiful, and the instructions of the senior disciple could be heard from the training ground. He kept correcting the students, telling them how to do things correctly. Memories suddenly came flooding back. Hong was sitting by the tree, looking at Zhou, and asking him why his friend chose Mu Hui. Zhuo, who had his back to his interlocutor, began to explain. He was thoughtful but calm when he spoke. Zhuo watched the young man diligently doing push-ups on the court. The man looked down and spoke of talented students, but that didn't apply to Hui. Looking at the temple with his sword slung over his shoulder, the boy recalled his friend's words about the duties of a mentor and the essence of martial arts, what it meant to create a martial arts master from an ordinary person. Hui thought that he could just pick a few talented guys and train only them, but that's in the past. Watching his charges train, he decided not to leave anyone behind. He kept watching. He wanted to coach these guys. He promised himself to ask Zhuo for a good drink when they met after death. And he asked Jin out loud if he was tired and ordered him to put in more effort. The sun hid behind the clouds. Only a thin ray of light peeked out between the trees. The forest path was strewn with mutilated corpses. A man in a hat and with a sword behind his back left behind those who dared to cross his path. He single-handedly dealt with several at once. Weapons were lying near the corpses. Obviously, they did not have good intentions and got what they deserved. Breathing heavily and sweating profusely, the young man tried hard. He literally had a heavy burden of logs tied together on his shoulders, and his bandaged head was the result of a recent injury. But he was not alone in his difficult ordeal. All the students were also squatting, each with their own burden. It wasn't easy, but those were the basics. The plum blossom that blossoms in these trials and hardships must have a fragrance so deep and powerful that nothing could surpass it. Hui's foot stepped onto the ground and he walked forward alone. He walked through the crimson forest, the wind picking up the pinkish petals and lifting them into the sky, accompanying his path. I thought about my first steps in changing the Huashan sect, which was to create my own martial realm. For a moment he heard something, continuing to have a mental conversation with himself. He believed that the sharper the senses, the easier it is to notice minor changes, and this helps martial arts. Hui continued on his way, thinking about the first awakening in a new body. Then he felt nothing. The senior disciple glanced over his shoulder and felt as if he was being watched. He tried to spot a curious observer who posed no threat, but he wasn't experienced enough to figure out who it was. The sun illuminated his path, and Hui already knew that he would soon develop his skills and be able to determine who was spying on him and where they were. Finally, one of the buildings belonging to the temple appeared from behind the leaves. Hui quickened his pace as he walked towards her. He needed to get inside. In a room filled with shelves, he found a man. He had a book in his hands, but the young man did not pay any attention to it, politely greeting Hyun-gak. Closing his eyes and standing with his hands folded, Hui answered Gak's question. The man was surprised by the senior disciple's interest in secret techniques, but he was calm, walked up to the table and let Hui do his work, and he moved forward. Without turning around, Gak suddenly started talking about his student who was rude to Hui, and he stopped. He glanced furtively at the man, trying to figure out who they were talking about. However, he had already beaten 3 people, which meant it didn't matter which of them was Gaku's student. In any case, the unfortunate man miraculously remained alive, but Gak still asked for forgiveness, which surprised Hui quite a bit. He turned around and said with a smile that Musan apparently deserved what he got and got off easy, and Gak also regretted that he couldn't train his protege properly. Looking thoughtfully at the man, Hui again plunged into his thoughts. He thought that he had caused problems for himself, but the situation took an unexpected turn, and he asked not to worry about it, because he was doing what he had to do as a senior disciple, and this statement surprised Gak quite a bit. He turned around and looked at the young man, not believing his ears. Gak looked at Hui carefully until he suddenly realized that something had changed in him. His gaze was piercing, not like before. Hui didn't break eye contact, and had already decided that Gak was angry because of his student. It even seemed petty to him, and the man continued to be surprised by the determination in his gaze. Gak's gaze softened, and he said that he did not dare detain him any longer. He watched Hui's retreating steps, not even imagining what the man was thinking. Once again, the table was strewn with scrolls and books. Hui sat and thoughtfully studied another book, intending to learn more about the techniques. He ran his finger over the hieroglyphs, reading about the combat sphere to understand it, because he needed to increase it. I suddenly remembered my past life, in which I fought not to kill or be killed. He remembered how strong he was when he was the Phantom Swordmaster, how his eyes lit up when it came to survival. He was a master swordsman, using all his knowledge and experience. He always held his weapon confidently in his hands. Holding the next book in his hands, Hui came to the conclusion that the first steps to improving his martial arts skills begin with a true understanding of martial arts. The sun outside the window was already preparing to set, and he sat at the table and tried to understand what the martial arts of the Mount Huashan sect were. Looking at the writing, he realized that he didn't know this yet. Because there were things that were forbidden to students, this was the way the teachers and elders tried to protect curious and greedy students who might foolishly start learning higher-level martial arts and make their chi ways useless, which would cause irreparable harm. As he continued reading, Hui remembered Zhuo telling him that the Mount Huashan sect was on the side of the weak. After studying a number of hieroglyphs, he realized that the sect's martial arts were very systematic and easy to understand. He had already managed to learn the most basic technique, the 6-fold sword combination technique, and then 3 more, the Sword of Directed Wind, the Sword of Falling Plum Blossom, and the Sword of 1,000 Fragrances. When he came to the conclusion that after mastering the principles of all these techniques, he could achieve the secrets of wielding the Plum Blossom Sword, the image of Zhuo with a sparkling weapon came to mind. They were needed to obtain the best combat technique that existed in the Mount Huashan sect, the signature technique. The names flashed through my head quickly. 7 Deadly Plum Blossom Swords, 3-Sided Plum Blossom Sword, Bright Plum Blossom Sword. Hui sat at the table and reflected that it was these secrets of swordsmanship that made the sect one of the 3 most famous sects of Murim. He thought about it and remembered what people said, that the top swordmasters from the Mount Huashan sect owned more than one of the 3 Plum Blossom Swords. The techniques, swords, and secrets could be compared to a tree, with the 6-fold combination sword technique being the roots, the Falling Plum Blossom Sword being the trunk, and the secrets of the Plum Blossom Sword being the branches of the tree. The 3 Plum Blossom Swords could be described as blossoming buds, meaning that a martial artist who had immersed himself in the techniques of the Mount Huashan sect would become part of a blossoming plum tree. Having closed the book, Hui came to the conclusion that he had only managed to get to the trunk so far, although he would have been happy to get acquainted with everything else. But for this, the Sword of the Plum Blossom itself was needed, beautiful and powerful, the symbol of the sect. Hui mentioned that they needed to get it as soon as possible, and didn't notice that he wasn't alone. Yu approached him and asked about the young man's desire to learn the secrets of the Plum Blossom Sword, and the senior disciple looked up at him. Hui quickly stood up from his chair and politely greeted the leader. He looked out the window. The moon was already high in the sky, night had fallen over the temple. The senior student sat opposite the leader and thought in confusion about how he hadn't even noticed how dark it had gotten. Yu picked up one of the books and asked Hui if he had read everything, and Hui confirmed his suspicions. Their conversation continued, with the leader asking about the morning training and the six-fold sword combination technique that the senior apprentice was practicing with the others, and the senior apprentice nodded in response. When the man asked about the choice of this particular technique, Hui looked at him with detachment. He became curious about the reason for this question. The leader sat opposite and now did not look at him. His gaze ran over the hieroglyphs in the book he picked up from the table. He sat quietly, studying what he already knew. The moon was shining straight through the window. Hui kept his eyes on his interlocutor and tried to guess what was on his mind. He decided to give the answer that was clearly expected of him, and the leader agreed with him without looking up from his book. But when the elder disciple said that the second-generation disciples had gotten off on the wrong foot, the leader was very surprised. Hui tried to correct himself and added mockingly that no, they hadn't even started. And this completely shocked the man opposite. Despite his interlocutor's reaction, the senior disciple smiled. It seemed to him that the leader must be aware of the terrible inexperience of the Sect's disciples. However, Yu sat and silently looked at him with huge eyes. He froze, unable to utter a word. He suddenly felt uneasy about what his student had said. He continued to study him with his eyes, and came to the conclusion that Hui's condition was quite deplorable. The night was calm, a few clouds floated across the sky, the moon illuminated the pink petals on the trees. She peered into the open window, as if trying to eavesdrop on the conversation of the people sitting inside. The unrolled scroll and the open book still lay on the table among a pile of others. The two sat opposite each other in complete silence. Hui looked serene. In the leader's eyes, he seemed completely different, not the same as before. The corners of his mouth turned down and wrinkles appeared on his forehead as he tried to understand what had changed the senior disciple. He looked down, thinking that Hui was upset after the Black Knight Palace invasion, since he was the only survivor. His thoughts were interrupted by the quiet voice of a young man. He said that now they knew everything. The leader looked questioningly at the senior disciple, not understanding what was being discussed. Still sitting calmly in front of the man, Hui explained that now all the students knew the six-fold sword combination technique well. The senior disciple calmly spoke about how he was able to improve his students' skills in using this technique. Yu, having recovered from the shock, decided to clarify why this happened. At this, Hui began to talk about the different views and ideologies that were closely related to the martial arts of the sects and clans in Jianhu. The Taiji Fist of the Wudang sect and their enlightened Taiji sword art. The Diankang sect's sun-crushing sword technique, and their silver moon-cutting ray sword, or azure cloud and crimson dawn sword, and four heavens-cutting ray sword of the Qingcheng sect. Kvi cited all this as an example in his own words. The leader listened to him attentively, and the young man continued talking about the ideology of clans and sects. Yu followed the words and gestures of his interlocutor, finding calm and clarity in them. Hui lowered his head. He was discussing the second-generation students' unreasonable desire to accelerate the learning of techniques. The leader did not look away, but looked straight ahead at the senior disciple and asked what he could offer. Hui looked up at his interlocutor and honestly admitted that he wanted to help them understand the true purpose of the combat school. At some point, instead of the senior disciple, Yu suddenly saw another person, the one who had already been saying something similar. For a moment, the image of Zhuo appeared before the leader, who believed that the plum blossom was far from the end of everything. The man's eyes widened in surprise, as if he had realized something important for a second. There was only one name running through his mind. It was as if he saw in front of him not Hui, but Zhuo, because the senior disciple was shining just like his mentor in the past. The leader closed the book, his fingers gently touching the hard cover. Now he looked at the young man with different eyes, seeing in him something that others could not see. He was curious about what Hui planned to do next, to which the senior disciple stated his desire to help the students master the six-fold sword combination technique. The young man's aspirations were confirmed by the open books in which he sought answers to his questions. But the leader was interested in the path of Hui himself. The older student thought about the man's words for a moment. He closed his eyes, trying to find the answer to this important question. I remembered how I studied the martial arts of the Huashan sect until late at night, surrounded by books. The book lay on his lap, and all he could think about was that no one had ever used a technique with a heavier sword. He remembered how, during the morning training, he thought about the principles of the disciples and the sect, and also about how his path and the aspirations of the sect might differ. He never found answers to his questions. Having collected his thoughts, Hui replied that there was nothing like that. He cast aside all thoughts of any other path, for he accepted his new identity, looked into the leader's eyes, and spoke of his desire to continue his teacher's work. Looking at the unrolled scroll, he added that he needed to continue to follow the path of his teacher and surpass him. The leader stared at Hui in amazement and he asked, "Isn't that a student's duty?" The man accepted his words but could not recover from the shock. The shining senior disciple, with a restrained smile, merely wanted to continue his mentor's work. Without taking their eyes off each other, they sat in silence. The leader understood that creating new military equipment was not an easy task. But suddenly the corners of his mouth turned up and the man smiled warmly. And he laughed loudly, closing his eyes. He was proud of the senior disciple. Still smiling, the leader said that Zhuo would be happy. He looked at Hui with a condescending smile. Now he was not worried about him, but hoped, because the student had revealed a different side to him. A satisfied Yu glanced out the window, his eyes shining with warmth and pride for Hui. The moon illuminated the trees with pink petals, and the scent of plum blossoms wafted from the street, and small grains of snow fell down. But the scent of plum blossoms that survive the harsh winter and bloom will be much sweeter and brighter. Suddenly, the leader remembered the mortal battle in which he lost those he could not protect. He kept his eyes on the moonlit night outside the window and mentally promised himself to help Hui. When the man said that besides the plum tree, other plants bloomed on the mountain, the senior disciple looked at him in surprise. The leader also asked if Hui knew why the sect had chosen the plum blossom, and this question left him confused. The interlocutor said with a smile that the young man should think about this, and then he would learn a lot. Leaning on the table, the leader rose from his chair. He was about to leave Hui. Despite the deep night, the courtyard was illuminated by moonlight. The leader walked outside, leaving Hui alone. He had already folded his hands in a farewell gesture, but the man turned around, deciding to say something else before leaving. Hui looked at his interlocutor carefully as he spoke about his loss, and concluded by saying that everyone experiences grief differently. The confused senior disciple stood behind him, and the leader talked about the unity of life and death, and advised him not to think of Zhuo's death as the end. As he walked slowly out of the courtyard, he advised him to consider Zhuo's death as his new beginning, and to think of his actions as a way to celebrate his master's life. This would help him cope with his grief, and Zhuo would surely want the same. Hui thought about the leader's words for a moment. Celebrating Zhuo's life sounded like a good thing. When the senior disciple thanked the leader for his wisdom, he turned around and smiled warmly at him. He walked slowly away, his steps gradually fading away. Hong sat there frowning, not liking the way his interlocutor was making fun of him. Asking through clenched teeth if he wanted to die, he heard another mockery. The big man's face was hidden, only his hairy chin peeked out from the shadows. Beads of sweat fell onto the tiles along with the tree leaves. Memories of a conversation from the past caught up with me just as I was training. Breathing heavily, Hui pulled himself up onto a thick tree branch. Logs tied with rope were tied to his feet. He pulled himself up and thought that meeting that crazy old man, the king of the Iron Mountains, had been very useful to him, because it was he who had told him about this harsh training method. He was hanging on the branch thinking about this, when suddenly another person appeared on the platform addressing him. Covered in sweat, still hanging from the tree, Hui looked at the one who had distracted him. The girl shouted excitedly that the time had finally come, but the senior disciple did not understand why the time had come. With an inspired face, the student reported that the sect leader had ordered Hui to come down from the mountain. The sun was high, illuminating the damaged facade of the building where matters concerning the sect's disciples of different generations were decided. The elders were once again sitting at the table, with the leader at the head, a teapot on a tray, and small cups next to each one, and documents lay in front of Yu and San. One of those present suggested taking disciples from external sects, and the leader approved this proposal. But another thought was that it was worth sending a disciple to check out the Shanxi outer sect. The leader frowned and looked down, considering the elder's words. The outer sects were martial arts halls established outside Mount Huashan to teach the martial arts of the Huashan sect. The fame and martial prowess of the main sect were attractive factors for the disciples, and young people wanted to enter the main sect. The leader studied the document in front of him. The worries of the outer sects seemed logical to him, since their forces had weakened, and Shanxi itself had suffered after the massacre. Looking at San, who was asking who could be sent to inspect Shanxi, the leader thought about it. He knew that the elders had no time to deal with such things, but he couldn't put off the inspection. The elders turned their attention as the leader spoke. But the words about Jiang Hu testing the second-generation disciples excited everyone, because the outside was still unsettled. The proposal to select several of the most talented students surprised the elders even more. However, when Hui's name was mentioned, one of the elders smiled and agreed. And only then did he realize whose name the leader had called, and he became confused. The elders looked at the leader in surprise, unable to utter a word. Everyone remembered how badly crippled Hui was, and even acupuncture didn't help much. A pale San, with sweat appearing on his face, shared his worries about the senior disciple, to which the leader replied that Hui had changed a lot over the past month. The leader looked down and smiled. He was confident in the young man's strength and thought that everything would be fine. The plum blossom petals were caught by the frosty wind. White clouds floated across the sky, the sun occasionally hiding behind them. The mountains towered over the streets of the town of Posong. Hui stood in the middle of the street, grinning contentedly. He looked around. Jin, Chal, and Hua were standing nearby. His thoughts about the drinks that could be found in the city were interrupted by Hua's voice. The girl saw an appetizing chicken with vegetables, an enticing aroma emanating from it. Hua's mouth even started to water at what he saw, but Jin sternly reminded them that they shouldn't forget themselves. As the four of them walked along the shopping street, Hua kept turning her head, looking at all the different dishes, and Jin had to reprimand her. Hui paused, thinking for a brief moment. Hua pointed to one of the food stalls, still drooling with hunger. She staggered when a stranger passing by almost bumped into her. The girl looked at the passerby with bewilderment and froze. The man who had pushed her also turned around, his gaze full of indifference, a noticeable scar on his left eye. A crowd of curious onlookers gradually formed around the students, and the passerby who had pushed Hua was joined by his friends. Jin wanted to apologize for the student, but Hui interrupted him, raising his hand up. Passers-by immediately assumed that the young people standing in front of them were disciples of the Huashan sect. Hua looked at the man in surprise as he spoke of the sect disciples' ignorance and urged her to apologize for the clash. Hui watched as his comrade argued with the stranger. They shifted blame onto each other. While the two traded accusations, the senior disciple speculated about the men's possible affiliation with a criminal gang. He looked around at the others and tried to figure out who was the boss. The gaze stopped on the man standing a little further than Hua. The man seemed completely unremarkable, his hair tied in a bun, a sparse mustache and goatee, but he was staring very intently at Hua's chest. His brown eyes widened. He didn't expect the attention to himself and what happened. The tip of the sword was aimed straight at the pupil. The man's mouth opened wide in surprise. The sword was dangerously close to his eye, and the leader of the group couldn't even blink from fear. Hui looked completely indifferent, holding his sword in front of him and looking at the dumbfounded man. Everyone present looked at him. They were shocked by his actions. The leader of the group even began to stutter. But the senior disciple did not even lower his sword. He held it evenly. His hand did not shake. The men, sweating with fear, looked at him in amazement. When Hui mentioned the underworld, the one who encountered Hua looked at him even more surprised. He knew that he had to do something. He smiled guiltily, closed his eyes and laughed awkwardly, trying to apologize. But the senior disciple interrupted him. Frowning and looking at the criminals with displeasure, Hui advised them to leave, his sword still raised, threatening to take the leader's eye. The man with the scar on his eye was dumbfounded. He realized that the young man was not joking. The senior student looked resolutely at the leader of the group. The criminals started to run. Hui lowered his sword, watching them go like everyone else. He put the sword back into his belt and turned around. Chal was still watching the fleeing criminals, and Jin and Hua's gazes were directed towards the senior disciple. Hua was about to apologize, but he interrupted her, convincing her that the other man was to blame and there was no need to apologize. Hui turned to the students. He understood that they were a little in shock after what happened, and he needed to distract them somehow. The offer of food delighted the hungry Hua. She took the initiative to choose food, while Jin, walking next to her, was gloomy and thoughtful. He was worried that he was going to apologize to the instigators of the fight. Hua's indignant face surfaced in his thoughts. Jin's gaze fixed on the senior disciple's back, his lightning-fast reaction not going unnoticed. Meanwhile, Kui walked at the head, and raising his eyes to the sky, he regretted that he had not hit the leader. Jin closed his eyes and silently promised to try his best to make sure something like this didn't happen again. His black eyes opened wide, his gaze determined and firm. Sitting at a table in a restaurant, the students waited for Hui to order, with a waitress standing next to him. Another empty plate fell with a clatter onto the red tablecloth. In front of each person there was a whole mountain of bowls. Hui, Chul, and Hua were arguing about how much they had eaten, but it was more of a joke, and Jin was still sitting there, frowning. Hua leaned back in her chair, rolled her eyes, and lamented that the leader hadn't really explained the mission. She didn't immediately understand what the senior disciple had said that was so remarkable. And then I realized it was about the criminal world. Hui's words about murder shocked all three of them. They looked at him tensely. It was dark outside, and the moonlight reflected off the damp leaves of the trees. The streetlights came on and there were many more people. 4 figures appeared in a deserted, dimly lit place. It became clear that they were criminals. They were armed and possibly committing another crime. The observer's foot stepped onto the roof. He tried not to give himself away with sounds. The criminals down there were interrogating the girls, and judging by their smirks, their intentions were not good at all. The students were tasked with obtaining all the information about the criminal world. Hui stood on the roof and watched, his hood pulled over his head. One of the criminals stood with his hand extended forward. There was a noticeable scar on his face, crossing the bridge of his nose, and he casually placed his hand on the frightened girl's shoulder. Caught in the hands of criminals as if trapped, she was shaking and sweat appeared on her face. The bald criminal interrupted the conversation, and the girl looked up at him with frightened eyes. The man's gaze was clearly directed at her chest, his intentions immediately becoming clear. These criminals did not look like mercenaries, who usually wore cloaks and hid their faces. Hui decided to intervene and silently appeared on the road while the men were pestering the unfortunate girl. He spoke calmly, even with a hint of disdain, but his gaze showed confidence. The criminals turned around in surprise. They didn't expect to be interrupted at the most interesting part. They weren't going to lag behind the girl. The guy in the cloak and with the hood on his head didn't bother them, but they didn't even suspect that their accomplice, who was supposed to stand guard, was already dead. Hui spoke again before he could attack, but the criminals didn't even understand him. They held the girl back, looking at the interlocutor who had intervened. Even their threats did not frighten the senior disciple. He followed them with his eyes and remained in place. He pulled his hood down lower, completely hiding his face. The accomplice advised the criminal with the scar on his nose to finish what he started, but he turned around. At that same moment, Hui jumped at him, landing his knee right in his face. The criminal flew back from the blow, falling on his back with a loud cry, but the young man in the cloak did not stop. His accomplice, although surprised, shouted indignantly at Hui, continuing to hold the girl close. While the scarred bandit was trying to come to his senses, lying on the ground and groaning, the senior disciple jumped towards him again. The moon illuminated his figure. His cloak flew up from his sudden movements. He was preparing to attack again. The bald criminal, still holding the girl, watched as Hui struck his accomplice again and again. The bandit's face was now covered in bruises, and blood was streaming from his mouth and nose. His accomplice looked in shock at the one who attacked them, and the girl managed to break free from his grip and hurried away. When he heard Hui's voice, he couldn't even move, covered in sweat and staring at his opponent in a daze. The senior student assumed that the criminal had martial arts skills and suggested attacking. He placed his foot on the body of the second bandit, telling his confused accomplice that he could let him live. When he spoke, his face showed no emotion. It was completely impenetrable. A thin stream was absorbed into the ground, and a man standing by a tree shamelessly urinated right on the street. His wrinkled face looked relaxed, as if he had been waiting for this all day. There were 2 people sitting at the table behind him. One of them turned to the old man with displeasure, but he seemed indifferent to his words. The man sat with a glass in his hand. He turned around and called his friend, wanting him to join. The second one silently looked away. With an apathetic expression on his face, the old man walked towards his friends, not noticing the bodies tied to the thick branches of the tree. He slowly approached the table, exchanging caustic phrases with his interlocutor. No one noticed the mutilated corpse among the tree leaves. The old man's friend said that he saw something funny and wanted to show it to him, but he didn't understand and asked again. Clouds floated across the night sky, lanterns illuminated the dark streets of the city, and voices broke the silence. The man wondered where the man in the cloak who had brought the food just a couple of minutes ago had gone. The street was still quite crowded, despite the late hour and the moon high in the sky. Kwa sat next to a stranger at a table filled with jars. They were whispering animatedly, the girl hoping to learn something interesting. At this time, Chal hid around the corner and eavesdropped on the conversations of people hiding in a deserted alley. Jin was looking for information in one of the bars, pretending to be a visitor and spying on the people relaxing there. He watched those who seemed suspicious, pretending to drink. Each of the students had their own tasks. There was a pile of barrels lying near the building, and dried grass could be seen under the piles. The area with its rundown buildings seemed deserted, but the silence was broken by voices as residents of the poor neighborhood tried to figure out where the smell of pork was coming from. The men were animatedly discussing the stranger. They were outraged by the brazen intrusion, but the smell of food attracted their attention too much. The uninvited guest stood with his back to them, Bags were lying nearby. The men immediately reached out their hands to him, wanting to know what he brought. Sparks whirled before them, blinding them. A stranger in a hooded cloak cut the ground with a sword and pointed its tip towards the crowd, sending clouds of dust flying up. The poor people in patched clothes remained silent. They realized that the stranger was dangerous. He stood there, clutching his sword in his hand, and then he threatened to behead anyone who dared to touch the food. A crowd gradually gathered around Hui. He looked at the man in surprise, who was impressed by his skills and said so out loud. The old man in front of him folded his hands in a respectful gesture and apologized, introducing himself as So Jinga. The senior student put the sword back into his belt, realizing that there was no threat and deciding not to frighten people anymore. He also folded his hands and said his name. So they stood in front of each other. Jinga expressed his regrets, because the leader of the beggar sect was unable to help during the massacre in Shanxi. But Hui reassured him, saying that everything was fine. He also added that it was difficult for the participants of the massacre to leave because of the terrorist Heavenly Sect, and the old man realized Hui's knowledge. Hui lowered his hands after listening to the old man's words and told him that he would like to know more about the inhabitants of the lower world who currently control Posong. He smiled kindly and offered to talk during the meal before the food got cold. Night had long since fallen on the sleeping city. Even the moon did not shine so brightly. Jinga ate a chicken leg, biting into the juicy meat with gusto, giving the impression that he was starving. They sat at a small table with a plate of chicken and a bottle on it, and Hui talked about the destroyed outer sect and the cruel blood faction, which was stronger than the ordinary inhabitants of the lower world. The old man continued chewing and informed the senior disciple that everyone in the cruel blood faction was well versed in martial arts. However, Hui knew about it. He had to deal with some of them, and they seemed to have third-rate martial arts. But he considered these conversations not the most important. Jingi stopped chewing for a moment, staring questioningly at his interlocutor. He didn't quite understand what he was talking about. Hui waved his hand to clarify that he meant the one behind the faction. The old man looked at the senior disciple with doubt and cautiously asked why the young man thought the sect had a patron. Folding his arms across his chest, Hui began to explain his assumptions to the man who continued eating. The Ryu sect was too big for a small or medium-sized sect. Posong was quite big among small cities, but a criminal organization still managed to monopolize it. He said that the pursuit of this was an obvious choice for those interested in the absence of power. And Posong was not so small that one criminal organization could take complete control of it. When Hui mentioned dividing control over parts of the city and competing with each other, Jinge was surprised to admit that the guy was quite perceptive. He couldn't help but say that it was difficult to perceive the senior disciple as a simple disciple. The old man lowered his eyes and admitted that he had been holding back because of his own doubts. But Hui was willing to listen. He sat quietly, paying attention. Jinge cleared his throat and began to speak. He spoke about the martial arts masters from the Guyu sword sect, who often associated with the cruel blood faction. The old man's words surprised Hui, and he plunged into thought, intending to sort out his own thoughts. I remembered that the Guyu sword sect was one of the 3 great sects of Shanxi. She was close to 2 of the 10 largest sects, but she never cared about the Huashan or Zhuangnan sects. Not only did they have a strong, carefree nature, but they were also larger in scale than Huashan. Hui thought, covering his mouth with his hand. He remembered the ambitions of the sect, but did they have the time and opportunity to focus on a place like Posong? Jinge chewed and expressed his doubts about the patron of the sword sect, Guyu, and Hui rubbed his chin and agreed with him. The old man had already finished his leg, but the senior disciple was still thinking thoughtfully. He turned to Jinge, expressing curiosity about the martial arts master who tried to remember, and then he said that it was the Red Wolf sword from the Guyu sword sect. Hui was very surprised when he heard the answer. He even asked again to make sure he had not misheard, to which the old man, taking a sip from his glass, suggested that the student had already heard this name. Jingi brought the glass to his lips again and only asked Hui to be careful if he had a plan. The senior disciple looked up. He was determined to know about this Red Wolf sword. Questions were spinning in my head. Who is this? While the beggars were eating the food and drinking the drinks Hui had brought, he was thinking, after all, I've never heard of them before. The sun rose over Posong, illuminating its streets with its rays. Hui opened the window and looked out, watching the city awaken. He folded his arms across his chest, his expression thoughtful and focused. He remembered how the day before he had invited the old man to have a drink together while they were talking. Hui smiled. He convinced Jinga that the drink was not alcoholic, as others might think, and they should drink together. The old man agreed and poured the senior disciple a drink from the bottle himself, while he was thinking about how to find out about the Red Wolf sword. The young man drank immediately, throwing his head back. He decided not to delay, although he did not plan to get drunk. However, his eyes widened in shock as soon as he felt the taste on his tongue. Like sea waves whipping up foam and caressing the skin, he was overtaken by the knowledge of something beautiful, truly delicious. The old man looked at him and with a cautious smile asked if Hui liked the liqueur, and he answered in the affirmative. And the words that the young man hadn't tried something like this for a long time surprised Jinga even more, because the senior disciple looked quite young. Hui cleared his throat, covering his mouth with his fist. He hadn't been able to enjoy everything properly yesterday because the beggars had gotten drunk quickly, and he himself had drunk without thinking about anything, because the drink he had chosen at random had turned out to be too tasty. He thought about the information he hadn't been able to gather, but a rough plan of action was already forming in his head. He pulled the handle of the door, thinking about the upcoming conversation with the students. Closing the window, the senior disciple looked with a grin at the bottles of liquor he had bought the day before. Now he could finish it all. The day flew by unnoticed, the sun disappeared, and a full moon appeared in the sky. Hua, Jin and Chal sat silently in front of the mentor and looked at him attentively, waiting for a conversation. But Jin and Hua managed to smell the smell of alcohol. The older student looked at the boys calmly from under his bangs and began to speak. He sat on the bed, crossing his legs and crossing his arms over his chest, asking to tell what the students had managed to find out. His sword was next to him, and bottles were visible from under the bed, which attracted Hua's attention. She asked Hui sternly about this, clenching her fists, clearly unhappy that he was drinking while the students were getting information. The older student didn't like her tone, and began to deny everything, looking with displeasure at the girl who had entered into an argument with him. He was not going to repeat himself and demanded to know what the students had managed to learn. Jin was the first to speak about the task, while Hua looked at her mentor with disapproval. The student talked about the Black Path faction, which was originally a branch of the Huashan family. They became the Bloody Trail faction and took over power in Posong. Hua reported on the depravity and greed of these people, how they resorted to violence at the slightest resistance, her face expressing displeasure. She turned her gaze to Chal, who added that the biggest problem was that these people were learning martial arts, and despite their low-level skills, they were still dangerous to ordinary residents. Jin only nodded in agreement. When the students fell silent, the teacher praised them for gathering information so quickly and decided to share what he had learned himself. He confirmed their words with gestures and decided that it was worth discussing everything they had learned, since they were probably convinced of what they had reported to him. His gaze was directed straight at them as he asked the key question. How did the bandits learn martial arts? Hui talked about combat technique manuals that were available to anyone, and that you could learn low-level skills with them if you tried. Only the bandits were people who had hardly ever held books in their hands, studied techniques, and rather used them as fuel for a fire. He concluded that they most likely had someone helping them learn martial arts. The students were surprised to hear that Hui had figured out who it might be, but was unable to find out the reason. Sweat appeared on Jin's face and confusion flashed in his eyes. He became curious to know who the mentor was talking about. For a while, the senior disciple sat silently on the bed, his gaze downcast and his intrigue still in his mind. And then he looked up at the guys and said that it was a warrior from the Guyu sword school. When he spoke of the Red Wolf sword from the Nine Hells sword sect, the disciples froze with expressions of utter stupefaction on their faces. The realization dawned on Jin that they were dealing with a serious group, and he stood there speechless, his mouth open in amazement. But the mentor remained calm and suggested finding the bandits, breaking into their hideout and dealing with them. The guys were even more surprised. Jin was confused whether Hui was serious. Chal even tried to object. He calmly suggested reporting this to the elders because the four of them would hardly be able to cope with such a serious group, and Jin looked at him with an inspired smile, as if his comrade had read his thoughts. The senior student chuckled and looked at the students with prejudice. However, Hua's words attracted the attention of those present. The girl agreed with Hui. She frowned. Her gaze became hard and determined. The student wanted to restore justice and end the lawlessness in the city. Jin looked at his comrade, unable to utter a word, his face covered in sweat. All sorts of thoughts were spinning in his head. He believed that he needed to assess his opponent, not the situation. The young man understood that a clash with the Guyu sword school was dangerous, especially after the massacre in Shanxi, and it had to be avoided at all costs. He voiced his suspicions of danger, attracting Hui's attention. Jin began to excitedly explain that a clash with the Black Path group could lead to a direct conflict with the Guyu sword school. Hui hastened to reassure him, believing that he was worrying too much. But the student was even more surprised by his words. He was amazed by the senior disciple's confidence. Looking at him, he even asked how he could be confident, to which he replied that the Guyu Sword School did not act so hesitantly. Hui continued to calmly talk about the cruelty of Guyu and how they would act if they were willing to do anything to destroy him. His face was emotionless, even when he added that Guyu could destroy Huashan at any moment. They had neither the time nor the resources to waste on worrying about such things. Jin looked at the senior disciple questioningly, trying to understand his words while he assumed that Guyu was unlikely to encounter Huashan. The chances of their involvement were slim. And when Hui was about to take the students with him on missions, Jin stopped him with his indignant cry. They stood opposite each other. The student doubted that the information provided by the mentor could be trusted, but he assured him that everything was reliable. When the senior disciple said that he learned everything from the Beggars' Union, Jin was even more surprised. Questions again overwhelmed his head, and he remained silent, biting his lip. The boy knew that the Beggars' Sect was a righteous sect made up of poor people. Any beggar could be considered part of this sect. No organization could compare with them in terms of numbers. They could look dirty, hungry, and miserable, evoking pity. But they used their connections to gather information and then exchange it for food or money. They were not to be underestimated. Despite their pitiful appearance, they could be quite strong because they studied martial arts and acted according to the laws of honor. His legs carried him confidently along the road, and Jin was still pondering the words of his mentor. He was surprised that such information came from beggars. The moon was high in the sky, a little more and the clouds would have hidden it. The four students walked confidently towards the gate. They were determined. And Jin continued to think about the beggars. They were definitely a reliable source. He remembered how the senior disciple had calmed him down while he was in shock, holding him by the shoulder before carrying out the task. Yes, he wanted to deal with the criminals, but first he still wanted to try to go the peaceful way. Jin admitted that he was too worried, but he trusted his mentor, since he wanted to try to resolve everything peacefully first. He frowned as he looked at the gate in front of him, telling himself to stay strong. The forest behind him, Hui told him to be ready. The older student destroyed the obstacle in front of them with a loud crash, surprising the boys quite a bit. Hua stood there with her mouth open in astonishment, while Jin remained calm and determined. People appeared in front of the students. They were talking in panic, not understanding what had happened and who had broken the gate. It was impossible to see anything through the cloud of dust, but Hui's firm voice still reached the people. A moment later, the faces of a determined Jin and Hui, whose eyes were hidden by his bangs, appeared. The senior student placed his hand on the hilt of the sword, intending to draw it out and sort it out. His gaze was frightening, and his posture clearly expressed readiness for battle, the blade of his sword flashing in the semi-darkness. The students stood amid the chaos they had created, still surrounded by swirling dust, debris strewn underfoot. The confused men opposite hadn't even drawn their weapons yet. One of the bandits stared in shock at the students' robes and recognized the symbol on their sleeves. When Jin and Hua expressed doubts about the peacefulness of the method, the senior disciple hastened to reassure them, but Chal remained silent. A man appeared in front of the students, who were ready for battle, and the bandits, who had drawn their swords. He was quickly approaching. One of his accomplices informed him of the suspicions that the boys belonged to Huashan. The man frowned and sweat appeared on his face. He had not expected such a turn of events. The students stood calmly in front of him, did not look frightened, and did not attempt to attack. He turned to them, accusing them of such a late ambush, and ordered them to leave. Only the students had a different opinion. They were not going to back down. Hui spoke for everyone. He pointed at the man, telling him to be quiet, which surprised him quite a bit. The bandit didn't look angry, but rather confused by the guy's actions and words, but he didn't like his impudence. While the students continued to stand quietly to the side, he turned around and ordered his accomplices to show these newcomers what their strength was capable of. The men quickly began to draw their swords, following the leader's order. But this did not frighten the students. They remained motionless before their opponents with drawn weapons. Hua's attention was drawn to something hiding behind the criminals' backs. Among the bandits discussing something, two people were lying on the ground. The man seemed to be covering the girl with his body. Both were covered in blood. The man's back was covered in bruises, and a pool of blood had formed underneath them. Hua was horrified. Her breath caught in her throat from what she saw, not believing her eyes. While the others stood still, she rushed forward. Jin even tried to stop her. She instantly found herself near the wounded, noticing the blood on the girl's body and the clothes torn in places. Hua knelt down next to the exhausted people, wanting to help. The man raised his head. His eyes were frightened. He tightly squeezed the shoulder of the girl lying on the ground. But then his gaze changed, as if there was a plea for help in it. The girl's eyes were closed. She was breathing heavily, unable to move. Jin and Chol ran towards Hua, calling her name. Hui stayed behind, but the student did not move. As she sat bent over the wounded, the bandits raised their swords over her head. Her reaction was lightning fast. Gritting her teeth, she put her palm forward, and she prevented the criminals from attacking with the bamboo leaf hand technique, literally sending them flying, her eyes burning with rage. A powerful blow disarmed the men. They fell back, choking on saliva. With a crash, raising new clouds of dust, the bandits landed on the ground. Jin and Chol appeared next to the girl. They drew their swords, intending to defend themselves and protect their comrade, although Jin found time to reprimand her. Hua was still sitting next to the beaten people. She kept saying that they needed help, and Jin glanced at her. The bandits she had attacked lay on the ground, but one of them found the strength to object. Covered in sweat, his brows furrowed in growing rage, he tried to urge his accomplices to fight the students. The leader turned to his gang upon hearing the man's words. Hui stood waiting. His thoughts were occupied by Hua. He reflected on her attack, deciding that she did not hit with all her strength, but held back, as she usually did during training, and he dismissively called her soft. He then shouted at the girl, ordering her to attack the bandits with her sword, while the irritated leader looked over his shoulder at him. The senior disciple's face seemed phlegmatic. He thought that these criminals were more unpleasant than he imagined. The gang leader was concerned about Hui's self-confidence and didn't want to take any risks, so he decided to first help his accomplices deal with the other students. Hui looked at him in surprise, following all the leader's actions. He hurried to his gang, ordering them to kill the boys. His accomplices had already begun to fight with the students. Hui stood calmly and watched what was happening. He did not rush into attack, thinking everything over. Jin fought off his opponents diligently, but he didn't seem quite focused. Blood spattered in all directions, and he didn't manage to repel the attack in time. The bandit kicked him in the stomach and the student staggered, falling to the ground. The enemy rushed towards him, raising his sword above his head, while the young man lay on the ground. He had already raised his weapon to deliver the killing blow, his eyes wide open, burning with the thirst for death. But Jin held his sword out in time, holding it tightly to prevent the enemy's blade from piercing him. The student was barely holding the bandit back from striking, while Hui stood aside and watched. He didn't interfere because he wanted the boys to experience the fear of death in reality, which was incomparable to training. The older student looked over to see what the other students were doing. He noticed a hand to the side, clutching the bandit's hair in a tight grip. It was Chol. He was holding the enemy, lifting him above the ground. The bodies of the defeated lay nearby, but another criminal appeared behind him, screaming, and with a raised sword he advanced towards Chol. The young man released his grip and the bandit's body landed on the ground with a thud. The new opponent swung his sword and was ready to strike stealthily. Chol deftly intercepted the hand holding the weapon, pushing it away from himself. With his other hand, he hit the criminal in the face with all his might, and he flew to the ground, sprinkling the earth with his blood. The gang leader looked down in surprise at his fallen accomplice, who had landed right in front of him. Chol looked terrifying, towering over the unconscious bodies with his eyes burning with fury. His face expressed readiness for a new attack. His gaze was hard and heavy. The gang leader, meanwhile, was distracted from the battle between his accomplices and the students and ran towards Hui. A cheeky grin appeared on the man's face, he mocked, considering the senior disciple to be the weakest. But as soon as he got closer, the gang leader found himself on the ground, his head hitting the hard surface. Hui stood nearby, holding a sword in his hand. The remaining bandits stood with their mouths open, realizing that their leader had been defeated. The student's power frightened them. They looked at him, not believing their eyes. The figure of an old man, calmly drinking, appeared out of nowhere, and he phlegmatically proposed electing a new faction leader. He appeared on the balcony in front of the confused criminals and voiced the condition. Whoever dealt with the students would have to become the new leader. A voice came from the crowd calling Mr. Red Wolf Sword. The disciples' gazes were also directed towards the old man, and Chol thought that this was the Lord of the Red Wolf Sword. Hui remained unperturbed. He turned to the old man with disdain, looking up at him, but did not hide the fact that he was waiting for his appearance. He seemed a little surprised that the young man knew about him, and even clarified this point. Then he smiled graciously, looking down at the senior disciple and taking his knowledge as an honor. But Hui hastened to disappoint him, saying that he had only learned about it yesterday and completely by accident, which left him confused. He continued to mock the old man with a carefree smile on his face, calling him a loser. Red Wolf narrowed his eyes and expressed indignation at Hui's words, because the disciples of the Huashan sect should strive for righteousness. But the youth with such phrases more resembled a follower of a demonic cult. The cup fell from his hand onto the ground and broke with a ringing sound, spilling its contents onto the ground. The old man jumped from the balcony, drawing his sword from its sheath, his cloak billowing, his gray hair disheveled, the moon illuminating his figure. He found himself in front of Hui, but he didn't look scared. He stood in front of him with a blank expression on his face. "Well, I don't even know," the senior disciple said with a bored look, when the old man suggested showing off his full strength. He was instantly behind him, leaving behind a cloud of dust and continuing to mock. The red wolf was amazed by his speed. The old man had already opened his mouth, but before he could come to his senses and say anything, Hui grabbed him by the head. With a sharp movement of his hand, he threw it to the side, away from himself. Red Wolf landed face down, his sword still in his hand, his elbow and knees sliding along the ground. He quickly rose to his feet, leaning on the scabbard of his sword, which he had not dropped when he fell. Having deftly turned over in the air, he again found himself facing his opponent. The old man looked at Hui warily, his face covered in sweat and dirt, his sword at the ready, and still amazed at the boy's speed. The student stood opposite, taking no further steps, while the Red Wolf tried to calculate his next steps. He frowned, clenched his teeth, not taking his eyes off his agile opponent. The boy seemed completely calm, and the old man tried to understand why he didn't use the sword. The old man peered at the student. He was attacked by doubts about the youth's strength. There was something suspicious about his skills. Hui continued to look towards his opponent. He had no reason to kill him. Gripping the hilt tighter, he came to the conclusion that he wanted to test his swordsmanship. He recalled studying Huashan martial arts, sitting among books and scrolls, wanting to learn as much as possible and combine his own skills with Huashan martial arts. The guys who fought with the rest of the bandits still didn't have enough experience. He stood and looked at the old man, not attacking first, until he gave him a chance to survive. The old man did not live up to his expectations, but he was still something. Without waiting, the Red Wolf jumped up and leaped at him, intending to end this fight. Hui merely stepped aside, and the old man's sword cut through the air with a whistle. The opponent tried to strike with his elbow, but the senior disciple deftly dodged it again. With an unperturbed expression, Hui bent down and opened his palm. His blow landed on the old man's chest. He used the bamboo leaf hand technique. The Red Wolf was falling rapidly, but the young man continued to advance towards him. His eyes lit up in the dim light, his sword hand drawn back, the other reaching out to his opponent. Hui swung his sword right in front of the old man's face, and he miraculously managed to dodge. Lying on the ground, covered in sweat, the Red Wolf looked at the young man in horror. Jumping to his feet, he stared at the head disciple, trying to see if he was counting his steps. The old man was breathing heavily. All sorts of thoughts about the guy's strength level and the difference between them were spinning in his head. He gripped the hilt of his sword tightly. Everything that was happening seemed impossible to him. Preparing for battle and raising his sword above his head and clutching the scabbard in his other hand, the old man recognized the boy's talent and apologized for his arrogance. He held the sheath in front of his face, his brows drawing together. He was ready now. His eyes turned white and he rushed forward, gritting his teeth and pointing the tip of his sword at his opponent. The Red Wolf's actions didn't seem to surprise the senior disciple much, but orange sparks flashed in the darkness, and for a moment, ruffled fur appeared. A huge fire wolf opening its fanged mouth rushed forward. He rushed straight towards the frozen Hui, but he didn't even move. The students noticed this and watched what was happening in horror. Hua screamed. The elder disciple gripped the hilt of his sword and swung. The blow landed directly on the fire wolf. Hui used the falling plum blossom sword technique. The enormous beast dissipated into thin air, leaving behind only scattering sparks. The young man smirked, unimpressed by the old man's technique, Redbud, which he had easily dispelled. Red Wolf was amazed by the student's knowledge of technology. He quickly approached the enemy, preparing to attack again. His movements were lightning fast, sharp. His legs carried him forward at great speed. But a sharp pain in his shoulder area forced the old man to stop, and Kui found himself behind again. Blood flowed from the wound. The opponent's sword touched him, and he was unable to block the young man's blow. He glanced over his shoulder, frantically trying to figure out how Hui's blade had hit him. Something flashed right in front of my face and flew by quickly. Drops of blood splashed to the side, crashing onto the ground. The surviving criminals froze, looking at the view that opened up before them. Blood continued to drip, soaking the ground, and strands of gray hair fell near the old man's feet. Red Wolf's cheek was covered in blood. His face now bore a wound, and his long hair had been cut shorter by the blade. The old man realized with amazement that Hui had put away his sword so as not to kill him. He watched the young man, becoming increasingly amazed by his actions. The Red Wolf lowered his weapon and stood looking at the young man's back. He was not worried about his wounds, and the thought of the young man's strength did not leave him alone. Gritting his teeth and frowning, he decided to test his opponent again. The old man cursed loudly at Hui and swung his sword. This time, 3 huge firewolves rushed forward. Hui turned around and got into a fighting stance, preparing to repel the attack of the beasts rushing towards him. He easily destroyed another of Red Wolf's vehicles. The whirlwind that erupted from the senior disciple's blow sent the old man flying backwards. Chal watched the battle in amazement. The criminals also stood with their mouths open. The Red Wolf held his hands out in front of him, as if he could protect himself with that, but blood was already gushing from the wounds. His eyes turned white with rage, and blood splashed in all directions. The old man was indignant, because he should have surpassed the young man in experience. It wasn't for nothing that he trained so much for recognition. The tip of his sword skidded across the ground as he tried to prevent himself from falling. "How did it happen that you so easily destroyed the result of my years of effort?" the old man wondered. He swung his sword again, holding his other hand with the scabbard in front of him, and rushed towards Hui, who gripped the hilt of his weapon tighter. Red Wolf couldn't understand why he couldn't track the boy's movements or strike him. With a loud cry, his eyes white with anger and a bleeding wound on his cheek, he rushed at the senior disciple. But he was struck again by a blow, and blood gushed in all directions. Hui stood, clutching his sword, leaving the wounded old man behind. The leader lay face down, having missed almost the entire battle. His fingers began to move. He was coming to his senses. Finally, the man pulled his head out of the hole, gasping for air, blood running from his nose and his mouth filled with lumps of dirt. He spat, frowning and breathing heavily. The leader leaned over the hole, rested his hands on the ground, vomited, and began to cough. The man tried to come to his senses and understand what was going on, wiping the blood from his face. While he was thinking, he heard screams and froze. The leader didn't yet know what had happened while he was unconscious, but the scream made him turn around. Red Wolf was mortally wounded, blood was gushing out, and Hui was standing behind him. The man looked at what was happening in stunned silence, forgetting about his own injuries. The hand of the defeated man rested on the ground in a pool of blood, his sword lying nearby. The Red Wolf reflected on how his years of effort had fallen victim to the young man's talent. He lay motionless on the ground, bleeding. He didn't have the strength to get up. He lay there and muttered something under his breath. Hui stood behind him. The senior student tried to hear the old man's words and came closer. He stood over the fallen Red Wolf, listening to his words. With his last breath, the old man grinned and mocked the young man. The senior student was surprised that the Red Wolf still had the strength for insolence. He kicked his opponent in the side and he screamed, closing his eyes. Now the old man lay on his back, his arms spread out to the sides. The young man looked down on him. His attention was drawn to the hieroglyphs burned into the Red Wolf's chest. From this inscription, Hui determined which part of the Nine Hells Sword sect the Red Wolf belonged to. It was the other world. The young man kept talking about the sect. He was well informed. He held the sword, standing next to his crippled opponent and continuing to think. Hui explained that the mission assigned to the other world during the war was to protect the headquarters and provide logistical support. But the other world wanted to gain an advantage, so they pretended to carry out missions on the side. The astonished old man asked the senior disciple where he had learned such details. When the young man concluded that the other world would hide the fact of the Red Wolf's death, the old man's eyes widened. Hui continued to mock. He was in no hurry to put away his sword. He towered over the fallen man with a smile on his face. Every word was imprinted on the old man's fading consciousness. The senior student looked intimidating, as if something frightening was reflected in his eyes. His shadow fell on the old man's mutilated body. The Red Wolf's eyes, deeply wrinkled, remained open, and the blood from the wound on his cheek gradually stopped flowing. The old man's pupils dilated as his life gradually left his body. The gang leader glanced at Hui, who was standing over the lifeless Red Wolf. The man trembled, raking clods of earth closer to himself. He stuck his head back into the hole, hiding from prying eyes. So, I decided to pretend I didn't see anything. A hand grabbed his clothes with a tight grip, pulling him back. Hui pulled the gang leader out of his hiding place, who looked away apathetically. He looked closely at the cowardly man, then ordered him to sort things out. The man looked back in fear, sweat streaming down his face. The room was light, and there were stacks of books and tablets on the table. Hui sat at the table, looking through the notes he had been given, with Jin and Hua standing on either side of him. The criminals stood before him, silent, their heads bowed. The older student crossed his arms over his chest and informed the gang that the money they had stolen would be returned to their owners. On top of that, he forced the bandits to get rid of the gambling den. When Kavi asked about the objections, the gang leader replied that it would be difficult to sort it out in one day. The senior student frowned as he looked at the bandit. The man was embarrassed and hastened to correct himself, but the young man interrupted him. Hui's condemning speech made the bandits lower their heads in guilt. The older student continued speaking, every word dripping with contempt, but his face remained impassive. The criminals listened obediently. Their leader didn't even think of arguing. Hui gave the task to the bandits, and then turned to his students. He ordered them to ensure that the task was carried out. Hua asked the senior disciple what he himself would do. The girl was worried that the mentor would start drinking again. Ignoring the student's remark, the young man sent the students on a mission, while he himself remained with the gang leader. He sat at the table with a dissatisfied face, thinking about Hua's words. Then he closed his eyes and smiled. He had other things to do besides drinking. He got up from the table and asked the criminal to take him away. Saliva glistened on his lips. He felt an enticing scent and wanted to quickly find its source. Images from his past life came to mind when, as Han, he tried to find answers to his questions about strength in books. Afterwards, the swordmaster searched for the necessary plant on his own, wandering through the forests. One day, something remarkable caught his attention in one of the forests. Then he sat down to rest after training. And now, in Hui's body, he followed the leader of the criminals down into the basement. The young man immediately recognized the distinctive smell, which grew stronger as they descended, and the man explained that it was 200-year-old Foti. The gang leader stood behind, lighting the way with a lantern, and the senior apprentice opened the door. Entering the room, Hui hurried to lock the door behind him. He looked around, noticing that the room was quite well fortified. The senior student saw the box and hastened to take it in his hands. He was salivating as he opened it, because Foti was priceless, and he didn't have the patience to eat this plant. Light emanated from the box, illuminating the young man's excited face. His eyes widened in surprise when he saw the contents. Holding the box by the lid, he looked at the huge glowing plant. He remembered the Foti he had eaten in his past life and compared it with what he saw, estimating that this Foti was 400 years old. Hui pulled the plant out of the box, arguing that it had come to him too easily. Throwing his head back, he brought the Foti to his mouth, intending to eat it whole. The night was gradually drawing to an end, but the sun had not yet risen over the city. The gang leader heard a strange sound outside and opened his eyes in surprise. He sat at the table, reading a book. The room was lit by the burning lanterns. The man looked out the window and saw debris near the buildings and dust swirling in the air. The dusty fog made it difficult to see anything. But when it began to dissipate, a young man's foot stepped onto the ground. Hui stood with his eyes closed, amidst the chaos he himself had created. The criminal hurried towards the senior disciple, who glanced at him. At first, the young man did not understand what noise the gang leader was talking about. Deciding to change the subject, Hui asked about the man's affairs, and he replied that he had already done everything. The elder disciple turned and walked away, and the leader bowed after him. But his face expressed indignation, because he had to humiliate himself in front of the young man. He turned back to assess the damage the boy had caused. The gang leader straightened up, the dust continued to settle, debris littered the ground. It was difficult to see anything among this destruction. The wall of the building was destroyed. The wooden beams were cracked. The man wondered what the Foti had done to Hui. Iron fortifications lay chaotically on the ground. The bandits were each busy with their own business. Their leader was sitting on the ground, leaning on a heavy hammer. He looked up at Chal, who had approached. The expression on his face inspired fear and respect. The man hurried to continue his work. Behind them, Hua was urging the criminal, who was hammering something, to hurry up. They needed to get it done before sunrise. The money lay in neat rows in the box. Jin, arms folded across his chest, watched from the side as the criminal bowed to the man and apologized for what he had taken. He didn't notice how a stranger was watching him from around the corner. Jinji made no effort to come out of hiding, continuing to watch thoughtfully. He looked at Jin and thought that Hui was not an ordinary guy at all. Continuing to secretly follow the student, he was in no hurry to emerge from hiding. The voice of the senior disciple, who suddenly appeared behind him, brought him out of his thoughts. Hui stood with his arms crossed behind his back. The old man was surprised by his appearance and did not immediately understand who had exposed him. The offer of food and drink left him stupefied. On the table stood a delicious chicken with greens. One leg was already missing. Next to the dish stood a cup with liquid. Jinga chewed meat. A similar cup stood next to him, and they chatted calmly over the meal. Kui said he would like to help with the reconstruction of Posong. He didn't care about the cruel blood faction's martial arts experience. The old man was about to take a sip from the cup, but stopped, looking at the young man. He sighed and closed his eyes, promising the senior disciple to keep an eye on everything. Kui looked at him carefully. Jinga took the bottle of alcohol. A clear liquid poured into the snow-white cup in the senior disciple's hand. They sat at the table together. Although there were other people in the bar besides them, no one interfered with their conversation. The moon was already shining high in the cloudy sky, casting its pale light on the leaves of the trees. Despite the late hour, the streets looked busy, with streetlights lit everywhere. The hand squeezing the neck placed the bottle directly on the carpet. The disciples looked questioningly at the vessel in front of them. Jin started talking about the rules regarding alcohol. Chal looked straight at the head disciple, and Hua looked down. There were 4 cups in front of Kui next to the bottle. He explained to the students that they had all successfully completed the task. He spoke about the inhabitants of the underworld, while the young people listened to every word. They sat cross-legged, their hands resting on their knees, their fingers clenched into fists. Kui closed his eyes. He looked tense. But then his eyes widened and a satisfied smile appeared on his face. When Jin asked about the senior disciple's experience, his expression changed to one of indifference. Their hands with cups raised up, the boys celebrated the successful completion of the first incident in Jianghu. When Hua first tried bamboo liquor, she admired its taste, and Jin agreed with her. The girl continued talking, and Jin reprimanded her, while Chal sat to the side, deep in thought. He recalled how easily the senior disciple had dispelled the Red Wolf's technique. He was tormented by assumptions. The young man could not understand where his mentor knew that sword technique. He looked up, staring straight ahead, unable to get what he saw out of his head. And I decided to ask Kavi about this technique. While Chul spoke, Hua and Jin sat quietly nearby and listened. Chal was confused and really wanted to know more about what he saw. The older student stared at the young man. He couldn't believe that the students were watching him. A picture of the battle with the old man and his fiery wolves appeared in his mind. And the way he fought off these attacks. The image of his past life appeared before his eyes again. Han used weight and strength, the principles of the Doko sword technique he had created in the past. Hui was surprised that the student noticed this. Hua also looked at her comrade in surprise. He promised to tell the guy about everything, but later, and he looked up in amazement. The older student suggested that the shocked boys finish drinking before he told them everything. He grinned slyly, and there was a sparkle in his eyes. A cart was moving slowly along the road, its wheels creaking. It was driven by a man, and he was driving along a forest path in the dark. Someone's voice caught his attention, and the man turned around trying to make out the stranger. A criminal armed with a sword appeared from the bushes. A seemingly nice old man threatened the cab driver with death if he did not give up his things. The students watched the tense conversation between the criminal and the unfortunate man from their hiding place. Hua came to the conclusion that bandits were operating here, and the senior disciple confirmed her words. The old man, meanwhile, had already set his sights on the cabbie's belongings, concluding that it wasn't that much. Hui watched this scene while talking about martial arts. He informed his attentively listening students that the bandits had strongholds. The words of the senior disciple alarmed Hua. The girl even asked again why they needed to know about this. To this, the mentor replied that these strongholds needed to be destroyed. He explained the plan of action while looking at the boys. The students were clearly alarmed by the new task. Only Chal remained calm. Hua hastened to clarify the reason for such a decision, even suggesting that it was a punishment. Her words surprised the senior disciple, and he began to explain why this task was necessary. Everyone listened attentively to their teacher. The students were not ready to harm others, so it was necessary to deal with this, and Hua realized everything. Chal suddenly intervened in the conversation, assuming the worst outcome of the events that had happened earlier, which made Jin tense up, and Hua closed her eyes, tears streaming down her cheeks. Jin turned around and decided to ask how Hui himself was able to overcome himself. Sweating from mild neurosis, the senior disciple tried to come up with another excuse. He suddenly thought of his first real battle. He looked away, lost in his memories. It was so long ago, but it wasn't something that could be easily forgotten. Subtle emotions flickered in his eyes as he sank deeper into his memories. The image of a frightened little boy with a cut eye and a bruise on his face immediately appeared before my eyes. He sat pressed against the wall. Next to him lay the body of a woman in a pool of blood, and not far from him lay a weapon. His eyes were burning. He chose to kill out of fear of being killed. But the guys shouldn't know about his past life, so he said that he was afraid of dying and didn't want them to get hurt. The disciples looked at him as he spoke and seemed to believe him. Jin stared at him, thinking about something. Hui stood up from his seat. The guys continued to watch him and listen to what he said. His next words were directed at Chal, who took notice. Standing in front of the students with a sword on his belt, the mentor announced that he would show them how to deal with the bandits. A few moments later, the criminal was already defeated. He lay with his head in the ground in front of Kavi, and the unfortunate driver bowed gratefully to the young man. Having pulled the battered and groaning old man out of the pit, the senior disciple assessed the extent of his injuries, and he hit him on the cheek, leaving another bruise. Grabbing the place where he was hit, the criminal pointed his finger to the side. The rest of the criminals appeared in front of Kavi. They were armed, and behind them the gate was visible. One of the bandits was surprised by the outcome of events, and after some time he was already lying on the ground with no signs of life, with the senior disciple standing next to him. The path was strewn with the bodies of fallen criminals. Hui shook himself off, leaving behind those who couldn't defeat him. When the sun was high in the sky illuminating Posong, the students began special preparations. Jin was tracking the members of the cruel blood faction from the roof of the building. At night, Hui watched as Chal dealt with criminals. The sword cut through the air with a whistle. The hand that held it was covered in scars. Kwa miraculously dodged, not allowing herself to be injured. Her opponent seemed strong and terrifying. The fear of death was clearly visible in the girl's eyes. But later, she stood with her eyes burning with rage and a sword in her hand in the middle of the street, strewn with the bodies of her opponents, holding the last one by the collar. Jin was breathing heavily, his head bowed as if trying to hide behind his bangs. He sat in the darkness, holding the hilt of his weapon. One knee was pressed against the ground. A palm lay on the other. The student leaned on a sword, and lifeless bodies lay near him. Hui watched him from his hiding place. He saw the corpses next to the guy. At that moment, he realized that Jin would rather die himself than hurt another, even though his skills were superior to those of Hua and Chiol. The older student understood why this was happening, but he believed that the boy should handle it himself. The student's hunched figure remained motionless. His face was not visible, but the silence of the night was cut by his rapid breathing. That same night, Hui reported that instead of 3, they dealt with all the bandits' fortifications in 2 days. The 4 of them were on an empty street. The senior student praised the boys and sent them off to rest. Hua decided to ask what they should do while the others stood silently to the side. The mentor's answer about teaching Chal a new technique disappointed the girl, because she and Jin would also have to participate in the training. Cutting the air with his sword, the senior disciple pulled his hand back. The next moment he made a sharp lunge, sending a whirlwind of power forward. A hole of impressive size formed right in front of him. Even through the clouds of dust, the stunned student saw her. Hui turned around and reminded the astonished boys of the technique they had already seen him perform, then clarified that he had slightly modified Huashan's 6-fold sword combination technique by adding more weight. Chal was even more amazed by his answer and even asked again. Pointing his sword downwards, the senior disciple began to explain. The tip sank straight into the ground with a grinding sound. Hui said he would be demonstrating his personal interpretation of the techniques, adding elements of illusion. He gripped the hilt of his sword. The frozen students continued to watch and listen, realizing something. The senior disciple mentioned the holy sword Huashan, his mentor Zhuo. Of course, his teacher was not the first to ever do something like this, but he was the best. Hui let go of the sword hilt, continuing to talk about Zhuo, recounted his thoughts on the 6-fold sword combination technique and its offshoot. The young man told the young people that the teacher was secretly developing a new technique. His sword glittered in the moonlight. KHV explained that using unfinished technology is irrational. When the students heard about the chaos that an incomplete technique could cause, they gulped nervously. The senior student pointed to the sword and asked Chal again if he really wanted to study this technique. Chal stood with his head down and frowning. It seemed like he was in doubt. But, raising his determined gaze, he answered his mentor's question in the affirmative. From that very moment his training began. In the darkness of the night, Jin and Hua watched as Hui and Chal stood concentrated a few meters away. This continued until the morning. The young men seemed to have stood motionless all night, as did Jin and Hua. The exhausted girl looked at them with displeasure. Her eyes were almost closing, and bruises appeared under them. She turned to her comrade in misfortune, and he looked in her direction. When Hua, frowning, suggested running away, Jin looked at her with a puzzled expression. Hui didn't look like he was tired at all from the long training session, he corrected Chol, telling him how to do it correctly. Drenched with effort, the youth held the sword up, the sun's rays reflecting off the blade, while the senior apprentice continued to give instructions. Despite being tired, Chal did everything his mentor said. And while his training continued, Jin and Hua decided to sneak away. The girl suggested checking out the Black Path bandits and taking a break, to which the guy agreed. The sun illuminated the streets of Posong, and the mountains were visible in the distance. A disgruntled man stopped in the middle of the road, urging someone on. Another one followed him slowly. He sped up, making excuses to the grumbling leader. Hua stood in the crowd and watched what was happening, trying to assess the situation. She looked thoughtfully after the members of the Black Path. One walked ahead, the other tried to keep up with him, and they did not stand out in any way from the crowd of ordinary residents. The girl looked up, trying to figure out if Jin could be somewhere nearby. With her hands on her hips and her eyes closed, Hua giggled contentedly and smiled. She stood in the middle of the street and thought that she could rest after such hard work that she had been doing for the last few days. A sound behind her made her glance warily over her shoulder. She pulled the sword from her belt and turned around, taking a fighting stance, but saw a girl with a child in front of her. Frozen and with her mouth open in surprise, Hua looked at the strangers. In the frightened girl with a swollen eye, she recognized a member of the Bloody Trail faction, who apologized for her unexpected appearance. She held the hand of a little girl with huge, admiring eyes. The victim introduced her younger sister as Yon Yon. Hua waved her hand shyly, rubbing the back of her head and closing her eyes, asking the girl about her wounds. But gratitude for saving her sister made her freeze in place. Her cheeks turned pink and tears glistened in the corners of her eyes. Hua stood there sniffling, and the girl admitted that the wounds healed quickly and mentioned her father's funeral. The student stopped wiping away her tears as if she had remembered something. An image of a bloodied man covering a girl with his body came to mind. Hua folded her hands in a respectful gesture and bowed her head, apologizing for the late help and offering her condolences. While the older girls were talking, Yon Yon kept her eyes on the student. Her plump cheeks flushed, her eyes sparkled, but her eyebrows drew together in determination. She stated that she wanted to become a great hero when she grew up, and Hua was amazed, slowly lowering her hands. The little girl's words again brought a wave of emotion and tears to her eyes. She bit her lip to keep from bursting into tears. Yon Yon's older sister, who was watching her, froze in a stupor, not quite understanding what was happening, and the student turned to the girl. When the little girl heard that she could also become a hero, her cheeks turned even redder, but she looked happy. Hua continued speaking. She closed her eyes to prevent tears from falling. She was too emotional. The girl asked the student if she was in any pain. She decided that this was why she was crying, but Hua refuted this assumption. They were standing near a shop with goods, and none of the passers-by cared about the three of them. The sun gradually sank below the horizon. Streetlights came on, and there were fewer people. When it got completely dark, there was no one left outside. The white moonlight filtered through the carved windows, illuminating the lonely figure. Jin sat on the floor, his legs crossed, his hands on his knees, his head down. He dozed off right in that position. The sun illuminated the forest path, but clouds floated across the sky. Tired from the long journey, Hua made an irritated sound and rolled her eyes. "At this rate, we'll die before we get to Vietnam," the girl complained, trying to catch up with Chal and Hui, Jin trailing behind her. The older student calmly remarked that they themselves needed to speed up. Hua continued to grumble, looking at the backs of those walking in front of her. Of course, her words did not go unnoticed by the mentor, but he only looked at her over his shoulder with an unkind gaze. The student covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide in fear. She should have kept her mouth shut, but Jin, who was following her, realized the awkwardness of the situation. He hastened to change the subject in order to resolve the conflict. The senior disciple gave off a terrifying aura as he stood in front and scolded his disciples. The others tried to catch up with him, and Jin thought that he had failed. Looking down and breathing heavily, Hua and Jin thought about the same thing. But the girl suddenly thought out loud about Yon Yon. Hui asked again with interest, and the student told about an unexpected meeting in the market square. As they walked, Hua spoke about the little girl's desire to become a great hero, and the young men even stopped to listen to her. After listening to the story to the end, the senior disciple left a caustic comment. After a moment, he stopped and silenced everyone. Chal glanced in his direction. Hui informed the disciples that they had arrived in Vietnam, and they were delighted, especially Hua. A beautiful view of the city against the backdrop of the setting sun opened up before them. The 4 disciples of the Mount Huashan sect stood and looked at the Vietnam spread out below them. Full of enthusiasm, with smiles on their faces and swords on their belts, they looked down. "Mu Hua, weren't you the one who just said you couldn't keep up with us?" The instructor's voice rang out, followed by silence. The sun was approaching its setting, painting the sky pink. The building with the sign Siongwa Gate looked decent and stood out against the backdrop of the mountains. But outside of it, chaos was taking place. One boy attacked another. There were 3 little hooligans. One stood to the side, the second held the victim, and the third was the instigator. He clenched his hand again, intending to deliver a couple more blows, and his fist landed right in the victim's stomach, causing the boy to wince in pain. The bully raised his hand again to hit again. Cruelty was visible in his eyes. It was clear from his face how much he was enjoying what was happening. But a strong, sinewy hand blocked the blow, stopping the leader of the hooligans. He was surprised and looked up at the stranger who had interrupted the fight. He looked back towards the bushes, hearing sounds. 3 more people came out from there, and for a moment the boy was confused. The beaten boy, who was still being held by another bully, looked tiredly at the strangers. Their clothes seemed familiar to him. He realized that the people standing in front of them were disciples of the main Huashan sect. Hui didn't let go of the little leader's fist. He calmly talked about martial arts and the possible outcome of such a fight. For a moment, a bluish energy sparkled around him, and his eyes glowed. He looked terrifying, but the angry expression on the bully's face indicated his dissatisfaction with the adult's interference. The older student looked at him, noticed the arrogance in his gaze, and came to the conclusion that the child's cruelty was the result of his parents' influence. With a frowning look, furrowed brows, and a wrinkled nose, the boy clearly didn't look scared. However, Hui continued to hold his hand. They looked into each other's eyes, as if neither of them wanted to back down. The senior disciple's face was completely expressionless, and he continued to phlegmatically study the bully with his gaze. He began to be irritated by the arrogant expression on the boy's face. His gaze darkened, and the young man already wanted to teach him a lesson. And while he was scolding the little troublemaker, someone's hand grabbed his robe and tugged it a couple of times, attracting his attention. Hui looked down at the troublemaker and stared questioningly at the exhausted victim. The boy's face was half hidden under his bangs. The bully standing behind him was no longer holding him back. The older student did not look away but seemed to understand what was going on. He released the fist of the leader of the hooligans and advised them to leave before they were punished. The little bandits disappeared quite quickly, leaving their victim with 4 strangers. But the boy already knew who was in front of him, so he folded his hands in a respectful gesture with a loud clap. He bowed, introduced himself as Manhwa from Siongwa Gate, and thanked the students for their help while the young men stared at him. A phlegmatic expression appeared on Hui's face again, and he introduced himself to Sana in response. A worried Hua rushed to the boy, carefully trying to determine the extent of his injuries, but he waved her off, saying that everything was fine. The student stood next to Sanha, trying to figure out who the hooligans were, and the boy confessed that the boys belonged to Dejin Gate, and their leader was named Ga Se-in. Hua sat in front of the boy, trying to find out why he was being bullied, and he, with his head down, confessed to the long-standing feud between the 2 sects. And the bullies bullied him because Siongwa had become weaker, Sana said, and Hui looked at him and thought about the arrogant troublemaker Se-in. The senior student kept his gaze fixed on Sani, and Jin decided to ask the boy about the sect leader's knowledge of the bullying he was receiving. All beaten and dirty, he lowered his sad gaze and replied that the leader knew and even personally visited the Daejeon Gate when the boy fought back against the bullies. He remembered that day. The unpleasant leader Daejeon with his arrogance in his voice, his haughty gaze and the thin mustache above his thin lips. He remembered how he and leader Siongwa left without resolving the conflict. Although Sana himself was clearly beaten, bruises were visible on his face, and leader Daejeon grinned at their backs with his subordinates. The boy stood with his fists clenched as he told all this to the students, and Hui realized that by stopping him and not allowing him to punish the bullies, he was preventing a confrontation between the 2 sects. The crippled, unfortunate boy suddenly seemed incredibly strong because he literally sacrificed himself for his sect and courageously endured all the beatings. Sana's revelations upset the emotional Hua. She couldn't believe that something like this could happen. Pain and contempt mixed on her face. The senior disciple looked up, wanting to hear the story from the leader of the Siongwa Gate himself. A building appeared with a sign saying Siongwa Gate, which meant that this was already the sect's territory. The sect members, dressed in white, looked at the new arrivals in surprise, clearly recognizing them by their robes. Sana walked ahead with a proud smile. Hui walked next to him, looking straight ahead, and Jin, Chal, and Hua, who was turning her head, brought up the rear. The senior disciple looked at the students of Siongwa Gate, noticing their attire and symbolism. A stranger appeared before them, recognizing and greeting them, and the group, led by little Sanhi, stopped, looking at him. The disciples of the main sect respectfully folded their hands and bowed, greeting the leader. Hui introduced himself to him. The leader mirrored the gesture and said his name with a smile. Sana left the disciples behind and went to Muguk, who told the young men what he had heard about the destruction of the blood trail in one night. But the senior disciple objected, calling it an exaggerated rumor. The leader placed his hand on his son's shoulder and praised him for bringing the honored guests. It was clear from his expression that he was proud of his son. The students were silent, watching the sweet family scene, and then Muguk invited them inside. The room was cozy. The sun's rays were shining through the windows, and the shelves were lined with thick books. Jin took a sip of the amber liquid in which petals floated. The students sat at a table laden with cups, with leader Siongwa at the head of the table, and Hui sitting opposite him. Jin and Chul noted the taste of the freshly brewed tea. Muguk looked friendly and smiled as he recalled how he once visited Mount Huashan and tasted plum blossom tea. The senior disciple closed his eyes. He held a cup in his hands, but was in no hurry to drink tea. First, he told the leader of the sect about their task. Opening his eyes and looking at him, he asked how things were going at the Siongwa gate. Muguk was silent for a while, staring down, but then he finally said that Siongwa was in a difficult situation. He began to talk about his bad relationship with Daejong, about their eternal confrontation. But before the forces were equal, the conflicts were insignificant. While the senior disciple was talking to Muguk, the others remained obediently silent, but their conversation made the students tense and nervous. Muguk recalled how he had to suppress conflicts, but Daejong did not stop provoking him. When the leader mentioned young Master Sian and his bullying of Sanha, Jin was surprised, looking up at him and confirming the man's knowledge of his son's fights. Hui, meanwhile, was calmly drinking tea. Muguk's gaze hardened as he continued talking about his son and the rivalry with the treacherous Daejong. He put the cup of tea down on the saucer with a bang, and a crack appeared along its edge. The leader sat with his face hidden under strands of hair, ashamed that he could not stand up for his son and his sect. While the senior disciple was silently enjoying his tea, the other disciples' worried gazes turned towards the upset man. Jin was the first to speak up, asking why he hadn't asked the Huashan sect for help. Muguk explained to the attentively listening students that he hadn't done this because of the current situation. But when the students themselves appeared at the Siongwa gate, he felt relieved. Every word the sect leader said radiated respect and pride. But the faces of the young people remained unperturbed, and only Jin frowned. "You don't trust us," Hui said, phlegmatically. And Jin, with a satisfied grin, was about to agree with him. He stopped himself in time and turned to the senior disciple, perplexed and trying to comprehend what he had said. Hui clarified that he noticed Muguk's reaction to his son's actions and therefore did not see the leader as trusting his students. Hua and Chal, looking at the senior disciple, were thinking the same thing. They didn't quite understand what his words meant. The man chuckled and hastened to justify himself under the inquisitive glances of those present. He said that not trusting the disciples of Mount Huashan was the same as not trusting the mountain itself. Muguk looked up and smiled good-naturedly, assuring that such thoughts could not have occurred to the leader of the sect. Chal rose from the table, sensing the tension in the room. Hui continued to silently study the leader with his gaze, thinking that he was refusing help in vain. But the leader quickly changed the subject and suggested dinner. The leader had hoped for something else when he heard about the destruction of the faction in Posong by the disciples of the Huashan sect, but saw very young guys, almost children. He immediately thought that they were too young and might get into trouble by trying to help Siongwa Gate. The leader was going to greet them properly with due respect and send them back. But his son's contented face reminded him of all the oppression he had suffered from Daejong and of those for whom he was responsible. Although Muguk smiled as he looked at Sana, his soul was in turmoil, and he could only ask forgiveness from all those who had been bullied by the rival sect. He stood up from the table, closing his eyes and smiling reservedly. Did he hope that these young disciples of Mount Huashan would help the Siongwa Gate? Looking up at the senior disciple who had risen next, he thought of his incredible insight. However, the refusal to dine with the sect leader puzzled both the man and the disciples. They rose from the table and stared silently at Hui. Hua couldn't help but comment, indignantly calling her mentor's words rude. The students looked at each other in embarrassment, and Muguk asked what the reason for the refusal was. Hui had no intention of arguing with the leader of Siongwa, as otherwise they would have wasted time. So he politely explained his refusal by saying that since the young people had not helped the sect, it would be wrong to accept their kindness. It seemed that his words shocked everyone even more. Muguk looked at the senior student in confusion. The guys also did not take their eyes off him. Hua stared at Hui with prejudice, not believing that he had just said something like that. She remembered how he threatened to kill Ryun right in front of the other students. She remembered how the senior disciple, with a frightening expression on his face, promised to spare the criminals' lives if they surrendered to him without a fight. Their conversation before the disciples burst in, with all their audacity, destroying the main gate and breaking through to the sect also still lived in the memory. She frowned, not believing her ears and not understanding what had happened to Hui. The sun was gradually setting, its last rays breaking through the green foliage of the trees. The students continued on their way, and Hua bombarded the teacher with questions about his strange behavior. Hui stopped, looking over his shoulder, and the guys froze in place. The girl had already decided that another reprimand or punishment would follow. Behind them lay the Siongwa Gate, its main temple towering above the forest. Having decided that they had already gone far enough, Hui decided to share his thoughts with his students. He said outright that leader Siongwa didn't trust them, and these words surprised the young people quite a bit. The senior disciple stood a little further away from the boys and asked if they found it strange that Muguk mentioned the retreat of the opposing sect when the disciples of the main sect appeared in the city. Hui began to talk about Se-in, the son of the leader of the Daejong sect, and how the young master had behaved inappropriately towards them. The students listened to every word and the teacher continued. He believed that there must be a reason for the boy's behavior. With his hands clasped behind his back, Hui began his monologue, telling the boys that the leader of Siongwa knew about the problems on Mount Huashan, and that the disciples sent by the main sect were only 4, and that ultimately, a clash with Daejong could promise great losses. His expression did not change as he spoke of the possible outcome of such a conflict. The absorption of the Siongwa Gate by the Daejong Gate, and the subsequent rumors of the Huashan sect's weakness. Chul and Jin tried to comprehend the teacher's words, and Hua directly asked how they should deal with this situation, to which the senior disciple calmly replied that this problem needed to be solved. The girl rolled her eyes. That was exactly what she was asking, hoping that Hui had some kind of plan, but her question remained unanswered. There were some delicious dumplings on the plate, and chopsticks were caught on one of them. 2 men were quietly dining. Cups and a bottle of drink stood nearby. A little behind sat the disciples of the Huashan sect. Hui was indignant that members of the Daejong Gate sect were walking around and eating in the business district of the Siongwa Gate like they owned the place. Chal looked up at him, looking at the shameless, grimy faces of the visitors, at their fingers relaxedly holding their chopsticks. The senior disciple concluded with contempt that these people full of discontent did not even try to hide their impudence, but were looking for an excuse to show off and demonstrate their strength.